Good evening, everyone. My name is Peter Bowman. I'm from Community Relations for Eversource. And before we get started, I just want to point out all of the exit signs here in the facility. If you're not familiar with it, all these doors go out to the outside. Also, out to the left are where the restrooms are. So that just wanted to get that information out. Absolutely want to thank everyone for coming tonight and listening to what we have to say and having an open dialogue this evening. What we really want to present is a little information about our Hopkinton LNG facility. I want to thank, like I said, all of you folks for being here. I want to thank my colleagues from Eversource that have joined us here also. We're going to open up tonight's session with Jim Blackburn, who's our manager and of LNG and a technical expert at the facility, and he has a couple of other experts with him. And Jim's just going to provide a brief overview. And then once Jim's done completing his comments, then we're just going to open it up and ask individuals who want to speak or ask us questions to come up to the microphone and ask your questions, make your comments, and we'll try to answer them in real time. And if we can't, we'll follow back up. We'll keep track. We have someone taking notes today. We'll just we'll follow up and get back to the community with any outstanding questions or comments that we weren't able to address this evening. So, Jim, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Peter. My name is Jim Blackburn. I am the manager of LNG engineering and technical services for Eversource. So my group is responsible for providing engineering services to the different LNG facilities that the company has. We've got about 10 facilities throughout New England, primarily in Massachusetts and Connecticut. We provide engineering, project management, some other technical type services to the different facilities and the groups. Tonight I'm joined with Phil Suter and Kirk Hayden. I'll let them both introduce themselves. Unfortunately, we have kind of a large room here, and I really think the intent tonight is for us to give you some background on the facility briefly and then really open it up. I wish we were a little bit closer so we could kind of make this a little bit more of a conversation almost around the table. But the intent really tonight is to kind of let us give you a little background on the facility, understand kind of what the concerns are, try to address any questions, hopefully maybe educate you more on what it is that we do and how we do that at the facility. So I guess with that, Phil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, good evening. Is it on? There we go. Hi, good evening. I'm Phil Suter. I'm with Blue Engineering and Consulting. I'm a chemical engineer by training. I've been in the LNG industry for about 19 years now. And my main focus is regulatory compliance, safety, hazard analysis, siting studies, PHAs.
Good evening. My name is Kirk Hayden. I am the operations manager for the Hopkinton LNG facility, along with two others. My background is in the energy sector for almost 20 years.
So Phil has been working with Eversource and really myself directly probably since 2015 or a little bit even before that with the company, both with our Hopkinton and our Acushnet facility. So Phil is very well versed with this site. He's spent a lot of time with us. He's helped facilitate a lot of the hazard and operability reviews that we've done. We've done in the past a couple of those assessments, actually even with the Hopkinton Fire Department. So Phil is intimately familiar with the facility, does a lot of projects throughout the country, working with interactions with FERC and PHMSA, who are the primary regulatory bodies for the LNG facilities throughout the country. And then Kirk, not to minimize what he does as a manager in our group, I think he kind of breezed over it, but he's really responsible for all the operations and maintenance at the Hopkinton facility, along with our Acushnet and Waterbury, Connecticut facility. But he is directly responsible for all the supervisors that we have at the facilities. And at Hopkinton, we do have three supervisors at that site. We have a plant superintendent, an operations supervisor, and a maintenance supervisor. And actually, they're all in attendance here to listen in to some of the commentary. What I'll do is I'll just give you a little bit of background on the facility itself. I'll give a plug to Hop News because we did a video the other day and we kind of went through a lot of this. So if you've already heard it, I apologize, but the LNG facility here in Hopkinton is a little bit unique. We have two pipelines that intersect in Hopkinton here. You've got one from Enbridge and one from Tennessee Gas. It's a unique opportunity here. So we draw gas off of those two pipelines. It's one of the few locations in New England that we have access to that. We take that gas and we cool it down in temperature. So we take natural gas, the same gas that you have out in the, that you would get off the street and use for your stove at home. We take that gas, we cool it down through a refrigeration process, very similar to what you do with your home refrigerator at home. It's the identical process, just magnified in size. We cool that natural gas down. It condenses into a liquid. When it condenses, it contracts about 600 times. So if we take 600 cubic foot of natural gas, we cool it down to negative 263 degrees Fahrenheit. It condenses into a liquid, about 1/600th of the size. We take that and we put it inside of one of the 3 LNG storage tanks on site. Those 3 storage tanks contain 1 billion cubic foot of natural gas. Now, that's not 1 billion cubic feet of volume inside of that tank. That's the vaporized state. So that's 600 times that volume, right? So on site, we have 1/600th BCF of actual gas in the tank as a liquid volume. So again, we always talk about, you hear 1 billion cubic feet of gas. That's its vaporized state. That's after it's been, reheated and put out into the distribution system. So there's many LNG facilities throughout Massachusetts. In fact, before I worked for the company, I lived right up the street from a facility, our Acushnet facility. I didn't realize that until I came and worked for the company. In New England, there's quite a few LNG facilities, primarily because New England is somewhat pipeline constrained. So while we do have pipelines coming into New England, there's not quite nearly as many for the volume and the capacity of the customers here. So what we as a distribution company do is we store liquid natural gas in these tanks. And you can consider these to be the batteries of the natural gas distribution system. So we're taking natural gas during the summer, we're putting it in the storage tanks, so that on the cold days of the winter, the January and February timeframes when we have those really cold days of the year, where there just isn't enough capacity coming into the system to really support the needs of the customers, we take that natural gas and re-vaporize it and put it out into the distribution system. Now, unlike a commercial operation, which is a few commercial operations in New England, we're not doing that with the intent of selling gas at these much higher prices than you would see perhaps during the summer. What we're really doing is we're suppressing the price of natural gas that's going out to our customers. So if you can buy gas at, say, $5 during the summer, and we typically talk in million BTUs. So if you can buy it at $3.50 or say $5 for even math, we may put that in the tank for, say, $10. We store it in the tank. Now, during the winter, there's days where you may see natural gas at $100. That's a big difference. Now, if you're the gas customer, that's a big hit to your gas bill at the end of the month because you'd be paying for that price. Instead, as an N-Star gas customer, you instead have natural gas stored in these tanks, the batteries of the system. We flow gas from the tanks on those peak days. Not many days of the year, but perhaps up to 24 days per year. And during that time, instead of you paying $100 for natural gas for that volume that you use, you're paying closer to $10. So for us, it's a great way to stabilize the price of the commodity to the customers in the gas distribution system. Electric ratepayers don't get that same opportunity. They don't have the same storage solutions that we have in the natural gas system. So the LNG facilities really are the bridge for us to ensure that we have sufficient capacity at a price that's economic to our customers until there's other energy alternatives out there. So this allows us to provide that capacity without needing potentially additional capacity on pipelines and other things. So for us, this is how we stabilize the price for our customers. As far as some of the recent upgrades and construction, obviously if you live around the facility, which I suspect many of you do, you've seen a lot of construction activities taking place at the site. In the last 5 to 7 years, we've invested over $200 million. We are forecasted to spend over $300 million, primarily focused on investments at the Hopkinton facility. the last couple years, we've really focused on replacing the liquefier. So many of you probably have seen the last probably month or so, the flare that you can probably see from the neighborhood. So that flare is utilized typically when we're getting prepared to liquefy natural gas for the summertime. So we would do that from April to, say, September. There might be some outages in between where we just, the weather's a lot warmer, so it's not efficient for us to be liquefying gas, so we just simply don't need to at that time. That flare and that liquefaction system and the project that we've been doing the last few years is to replace that. So very shortly here, we're currently commissioning the new facility. We're hoping and expecting that you will not see the use of that flare regularly. You're still going to see the structure there. We're not going to eliminate that immediately because we need to prove the new system's reliable. But in the coming months and hopefully over the next few years, you should pretty much either see very limited use or no use of that flare coming up. So that'll be a positive that you should recognize here very shortly. There were a lot of other improvements with the new liquefier, so we're really trying to remove most of the equipment that's on kind of the uphill side of the facility and migrate a lot of that equipment down to the tank farm area, which is where you see the blue tanks. Improvements related to that, the new liquefier technology that we installed utilizes nitrogen as a refrigerant. A lot of what you're seeing being flared at the existing flare are the old refrigerants that were being used at the other side of the site. Those included propane, ethylene, and methane as the refrigerants. Those things will be really being eliminated by the new system, and so we'll be utilizing nitrogen. So when we vent nitrogen, there won't be a flare associated with it. There won't be any emissions related to that. We're utilizing all new modern technology over there, so new gas turbine with low NOx emissions. We've really spent a lot of time improving the overall system. You'll see a lot of new modernized technology over there. Some of the other major investments, and obviously tanks had been a big portion of the conversation that's been had the last month or so here. We have invested quite a bit into Tank B and to overall the systems at the facility. We've put quite a bit of time and money into modernizing those facilities to the extent that's possible. When you look up at Tank B now, you'll see there's a structure on top. That's part of the modernization effort that we've had with the facilities. We had an opportunity to get inside that tank this past 2 years and fully inspect it, and it was a very good opportunity for us to really assess the condition of that. And overall, we feel very confident that that tank, along with the other two, really represented a good indicator of really the life and the condition of those assets. And we were very happy and content with what we found there. So it really proved kind of what we had been anticipating over the years related to the condition of those. We as a company have really coalesced around the Hopkinton facility as our primary location for kind of our supporting staff and such. So you'll see there's quite a contingent of primarily my folks and then some of the other folks related to Kirk's group that report out of that location. We have a focus on the facility, improving, operations every day. We invest quite a bit into obviously the capital investments, and we also put quite a bit of time into improvements of the maintenance efforts that we do at that site and really all the sites. So we've really focused around providing strong technical assistance to the site. As a company, we really have invested in the idea that we need to have a large group to support properly all the activities that we're doing both here and across the fleet that we have. So I think with that, what we'd like to do is we're hoping this to be kind of a Q&A session. I could talk about LNG topics probably all night, but that's not specifically what you want to hear. There's probably quite a few questions or concerns that we would like to understand and better addressed. So I think, Peter, I don't know how you want to go about this, but we'd like to try to hear what those concerns are so we can try to address them. And if we can't address them, we'd like to, take those back and hopefully provide a response here in the near future.
Thanks, Jim. So what Jim just gave a brief overview, and what I didn't do when I had my introduction, I thank the community and the neighbors for attending. I see a lot of public officials here. I want to thank them for coming. The police chief, Chief Miller, Deputy Chief Doherty, as well as members of the select board. So I want to thank them for all coming and giving of their time tonight and partaking in this forum. So as Jim said, we're going to open it up to comments, questions, and I had spoken to the select board chair a little while ago, and I know she'd like to make some comments. So
I'm going to let the neighbors ask their questions.
okay, all right. But we had a good dialogue a little while ago. So I would just ask anyone that wants to please come up to the microphone and ask questions, make comments, and like I said, we have someone taking notes, and we'll attempt to answer them here in real time. But if we can't, we'll obviously take them away and get back to you. Great, thank you. Do you want to come up? Sure.
Thanks. I can come out on one side. No, it's okay. So thank you so much for hosting this meeting. When we raised some of the concerns, we actually had requested the town to host a public forum, and this, according to us, was a public forum. I wish I could get a chance to present, hopefully after this question-answer session. So one of the first questions that I have is just regarding the tanks itself. I know the tanks were built to last a certain time frame, and that was mentioned in the Fuss and O'Neill report, which was in the, a company that Eversource actually worked with. So in general, what is the life expectancy of tanks, of these tanks? I know that, I did listen to the interview. I know that it was mentioned that the regular standards do not apply to these tanks, mainly because they've been grandfathered in, and we understand that. But as any equipment is bound to fail at some point, and this is made of steel on the inner side, I assume. So because especially the tank B had a crack, 16-foot crack, I believe, in 1983, and then had a thermal event as well. So you mentioned that this tank was, you've put in a lot of money to fix the tank. So one of the first questions that I want to ask is, how long will are these tanks good for? That is the first question. And the second question is, with regards to tank B per se, was anything done, so was it actually fully replaced, or only was it like welded, meaning that small fixes were done, and will it be checked periodically? That is a question with regards to tank B, because tank B is the one which was built much later, as far as I understand, but it did seem to have some problems, at least with regards to thermal anomaly and the temperature fluctuations that it had. We did go through some of those reports as well. So how long will these tanks be good for, and what were the exact fixes that were done with regards to tank B, and will Eversource or DPU or PHMSA guarantee that these tanks will not fail? There wouldn't be a vapor cloud right on top, because when certain reports were passed through, for example, Smith and Burgess report says that, of course, it was a report which kind of showed that a worst case scenario. But there were trees at that time, but now there are more than 2,000 people who are living extremely close to the facility. We all have small children, and there's a 55+ trails community like exactly opposite to this facility. So there are a lot of people now. Can Eversource, DPU, PHMSA guarantee that there wouldn't be a problem and put our children and all of us at risk? So we'll start from these questions. Thank you.
Sure. So, certainly there's no guarantees in life, and I'm not sure that any one of those groups could give such a guarantee. However, let's talk a little bit about the tank itself and what took place, on Tank B. So the three tanks, two of the tanks were constructed in around 1972, Tank A and Tank B. Those are the first two, kind of, if you work your way off of Wilson Street. So Tank A was built in around 1972 and Tank B around the same time, maybe 73. Tank C was built closer to 74, 75. So that one's actually...
B 67, two tanks 67, one tank in 7.
No, that's not true. So 1967, there were two tanks built on 52 Wilson Side Street. So up where the existing liquefier is, the high side, like the hill where the flare is, there were two storage tanks that were built actually underground in the original facility construction. That was 1967, 68. Those were abandoned fairly soon after that and constructed Tank A and Tank B in 1972, 1973-ish. Tank C was built shortly thereafter, 75-ish time frame, 74, 75. So Tank C is actually the more modern of them. In fact, if you look at that tank previous to Tank B's upgrades, Tank C always had a large platform at the top. You'll kind of see that. I don't think you can see it on the picture here, but on Tank B, now we have this kind of upper platform area. That's kind of part of the modernization. You'll see Tank C already had that. So what that is on Tank C, we always had this, and on Tank B, we now have this, but we pump from the bottom of the tank up to the top of that platform instead of going out the side of the tank, so we eliminated that side penetration. So Tank B was built, was the second tank built. As far as what took place for work inside of Tank B, so there really were very limited repairs. There were no cracks found, there were no leaks that were found. What we did is we cut a hole in the side of the tank, we went inside of the tank, we inspected it, we inspected all the welds inside the tank. We had a tank manufacturer, as one of two that are primarily the major tank manufacturers in the world who deal with cryogenic storage tanks. They performed all the NDEs, or the non-destructive examination, all the weld inspections. They came inside and top to bottom inside that tank, went through it, reviewing kind of the condition of the overall tank, measuring wall thickness, looking at the structure, confirming that it was built in accordance with the drawings that were produced back in the 60s, and they confirmed that all that had been done as had been designed. As far as repairs go, the only thing that was found that required repair inside the tank is, I believe there was one pipe support kind of up in the upper elevation of the tank that was, I guess, reattached. Probably had either never been attached during original construction or otherwise had maybe vibrated or something, but regardless, it was a fairly minor repair, had no consequence to the tank itself. It was not even inside the liquid area of the tank. The other thing that had happened is there's a temperature indicating probe on the side of the tank. There's many of them throughout the tank. At some point in time in the life of the tank, that probe had been modified in a way that allowed moisture to migrate from external to the tank, so on the, just on the outside of the tank. It allowed moisture to migrate into the insulation, which is a perlite. So perlite is, I believe, like a volcanic rock that's been heated up and it pops almost like a popcorn into this kind of powdery insulation that is, used inside the tank. So that tank has two walls. It has an inner wall and an exterior wall. The inner wall is based primarily on a stainless steel material, 9% nickel alloy. That's good for cryogenic temperatures. The outer tank wall that you see here painted blue, that is really to hold the insulation up to the tank and then also to capture the top of the tank. There is no top on the inner tank, so it captures any of the boil-off gas, which is the gas that has converted from a liquid back into a vapor, and the tanks don't operate at pressure, so they basically operate at less than 1 pound pressure. So what we draw off that gas, we compress it and put it out into our distribution system. So that kind of captures that. So what this was doing is this allowed a pathway of moisture to go into the tank in that little area, and as the moisture came in, it would freeze. And what we found is that was causing that cold spot anomaly, because now you had a path with the ice to draw more coldness into that spot. So there was no weld repairs, there was no cracks that we found. The tank was in very good condition. I'd been in a few times. We had another group that, primarily focused on the tank itself that was dedicated to that. For me, it was very unique to be able to see, writings from the original welders that were in there from the soapstone that they used to be able to see that inside of that tank. LNG is cryogenic, it's negative 263 degrees Fahrenheit, it's colorless, it's odorless, it's non-corrosive, and obviously because it's storing natural gas, we don't want oxygen in there. So not being corrosive, not having oxygen lends itself, along with the high nickel alloy material of the wall, lends itself to preventing any type of corrosion, which typically with tanks is what you're concerned about. You're worried about corrosion. That's what you see on oil tanks. That's what you would see on other types of steel vessels. In this case, we really don't have that concern, and what we found is that was not something that we found as being exhibited in there. So overall, the condition of the tanks was very good. As far as some of the other reports, such as the Fuss and O'Neill report, which was a condition type assessment of the facility, we utilized that or commissioned that report, I think back in 2013 or so, might have been 12-13 timeframe. That report we utilized basically as a basis to understand what it was that we should be investing in at the facility. The liquefier was high on the report's list. So as you suggest, there are many pieces of equipment that over a design life of say 30 years, which is very typical for industrial equipment. So when we go out and we specify to an engineering contractor, we want you to build a piece of equipment, we specify 30 years. That's pretty much across the board. I actually think that started with the nuclear industry. That was kind of where everyone set the standard. We need a minimum design life of 30 years. For the liquefier equipment, you have a lot of rotating equipment. You have a lot of pumps, a lot of compressors. Those are wearing parts. Pieces are moving, they're shaking. Those absolutely require constant maintenance. And Kim, who's in charge of, responsible for the maintenance of the facility, they put a lot of effort in that type of equipment. The storage tanks are primarily static. They just are sitting there. There's not moving parts. It's non-corrosive because of the fluid that we have in there. And absolutely, many storage tanks, corrosion is a bit, even firewater storage tanks, we spend a lot of time with fighting corrosion and making sure that does not become a problem. In this case, this is one of the few instances of tanks that I've dealt in my career where corrosion is the one thing that we're not really contending with LNG storage. So we put quite a bit of effort into that. The Sanborn, not the Sanborn head, the Fuss and O'Neill report has really been our guidance document on the areas that we should focus on for investments. The liquefaction equipment, that needed replacement. We're wrapping that up. I think today the plant will be very happy when they get their new piece of equipment because, that is really a time-consuming amount of maintenance that goes into that. Vaporizers, that's a primary function at the facility. Those are actually all the way up at the hill, probably closest to the Legacy Farms area. Those we didn't replace the entire system, but we replaced a lot, basically 95% of the entire system. So we kind of got those revamped. We've put in new generators, new piping systems. We've done an awful lot with support systems. The tanks themselves were really quite low on the report. And again, because of their static condition, because of the condition of them, tanks are driven. So if you don't have corrosion, you don't have moving parts, we do have cycles. And so cycles on an LNG storage tank is probably the most important part. And what that is in an LNG storage tank, when you have these large thermal changes, right? So if you go from negative 263 degrees Fahrenheit to say 70 degrees Fahrenheit during the summer with the ambient conditions. With LNG storage tanks, that's what drives the life cycle of a storage tank. That cycle in thermal temperature, that only happens when you empty LNG storage tanks. You get that large cycle. So typically, when we look at the cycles of a storage tank, they're typically designed with 10,000 or more cycles. For tank B, I think we're on cycle number 3. So I don't want to say that an LNG storage tank has got an indefinite life. That's not a correct statement at all. Everything has a life period. But for the LNG storage tanks, based on the assessment of that recently on tank B, the manufacturer that supported us with it believes it's at a minimum only 30% into its life cycle. So they believe we have very long period of time associated with that equipment. That doesn't mean it doesn't need maintenance. It doesn't mean it should just gloss over it and never inspect it again and kind of walk away. Absolutely, it still needs to have continued inspections. We do regular inspections of the foundation to make sure that there's no movement of it. We do visual inspections to make sure there's no cracking. We continue to paint the tank. I know that's a constant kind of battle out there. The recent cold weathers, we had just painted the tanks, and believe it or not, the cold weather out there, we had pieces, essentially flake off because of that. So constant maintenance. But really, the LNG storage tanks are the one area in the facility that really are static and do not require or not anticipated to have this kind of finite short-term duration of a life. So we'll continue to inspect them. We'll continue to ensure that they're appropriately maintained. But to be able to set a specific time period to it, I think that's challenging for everyone. But as we look at it today, we certainly have a fairly long period of time in front of it. The three of us actually all have young kids. I can absolutely sympathize with having my children around there. My kids have been to the site multiple times to come see me. We work at that site. Probably my wife would say I spend a lot more time there than I do at home. She's probably not far off. We want that site to be safe. I think that we as a company genuinely put a lot of time and effort and try to do the right thing at all the sites, not just Hopkinton. So, I understand that. That's your home. You have your children there. I completely understand that. I live right close to a very large energy facility myself. It's not an LNG facility, but that's important to us. I recognize that. And we are absolutely going to do the right things to make sure that we're putting the time and effort to do things properly at the plant. I think you'll get that. I think there's a level of professionalism both from our supervisors to our management and our senior executives, and the amount of time and effort that we invest into that site. So, do you have?
I had two minor things to add, but you have a follow-up first, or?
I just had another question. You can.
Yeah, so two things to add. I think Jim did a real good job. The design life. Usually engineers will spec out the 25 and 30-year design life is very, very common. That doesn't mean that every single component at a plant will last 30 years. In fact, I've never been to a facility where it's brand new and they haven't had to replace a single component for the first 30 years. It's usually the rotating equipment. You might have transmitters and stuff that fail, but that 30-year design life is used by the engineer to identify what the operations, maintenance, replacement, and initial equipment selection. That doesn't mean that 30 years everything's going to fall apart, and you will have things like a transmitter or a piece of rotating equipment that does have to be replaced. But like you mentioned, it's usually the static pieces of equipment that have the longest design life. And you're right on thermal cycling. The other thing you mentioned was thermal anomalies. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be an upcoming failure. So a lot of tanks will have potential cold spots because of perlite settlement. So as Jim mentioned, you have your inner tank and your outer tank, and you have the perlite, which is the insulation that goes in between. Over the years, you can have different settlements of perlite where you can have voids and gaps in the perlite. And so routinely, people take thermal images of their tanks to identify if there is any gaps where you could see cold spots, and there's things that you can do to prevent that. So just because you have that doesn't mean there's a failure. It just means it's something that you need to be aware of where you want to address it, and you could do that by vibrating the perlite to try to fill that in, top filling it, or adding additional perlite. Just want to add those two things, but go ahead, follow up.
So this is just for understanding, because as I was reading and I started learning about this, I understood that there is an above ground LNG and then underground and in-ground. So is this an in-ground LNG tank?
This is above ground.
Fully above ground.
Fully above ground. So you've got the foundations, and then above that is the tank. It's built above ground.
Okay.
Underground storage tanks today, maybe in Japan, there was a number of them.
Overseas is the only thing that I'm aware of that has in-ground tanks. In the U.S., every tank is above ground.
Yeah, because so one of the things that I was reading is that there was a tank built in 1965 in Algeria, an in-ground tank, so that actually in that particular report they gave example of the Hopkinton facility, and that's available online, and it mentioned, I can just read it out to you. So it essentially mentioned in terms of examples of the tanks, right? So there's one which is a transcontinental gas pipeline. This one is in New Jersey, and another one in England. And the third one, which was mentioned in the article, is the Tennessee Gas Pipeline Company, Hopkinton, Massachusetts. And so the one which was built in 1965 in Algeria, they have completely decommissioned it. And the reason that they mention is that although it had successfully undergone good service conditions, but it developed some natural problems, such as distortion, cracks, and inflation of the surrounding ground, working condition problems, and structural problems. So when I read these things as a mom, it will, it scares me. And then it also says that at Hopkinton, 2 tanks had been constructed. The major problem was cracks in the rock and communication at 100 feet of depth between the 2 tanks. So this may be the one that you are referring to, which you have decommissioned. Maybe that, right? So just again, this is for understanding. So the 2 of them which were completely decommissioned, are they at the same facility, or these tanks were built on top of it? The reason I'm asking is these LNG tanks must have some heating elements to maintain, the vapor. I mean, I'm not an expert again. So if there are heating elements, as someone who cooks on a daily basis, I know that it can get dirty. It will go bad eventually. Most of the time, heating elements, maybe they're made of iron. It would rot. So how do you guys manage to maintain all that if those heating elements are underground? So again, these questions are not to confront Eversource in any way. This is just so that we understand. We don't need every single detail, but again, just to make sure that these complicated equipments are being maintained in a great condition. And if there is an issue, apart from the DPU knowing, if the town fire department knows, and then eventually it comes to us, if we have to leave, we want to leave, right? So
this makes a lot more sense now, some of the questions. So there were 2 tanks installed on site that were below grade, as I had said earlier. They were essentially carved out of the granite. Now, if you drive up Wilson Street, you can see the granite on the side of the road. It's everywhere. The only people that don't recognize that there's granite throughout Hopkinton are the contractors that show up on site and then charge us change orders because they found rock and they're surprised. So they carved the tanks out of the granite. Granite is full of cracks. And so what they had at the Hopkinton site, and this is based on historical drawings that we have, and I think there's even a couple aerial photos from the original plant. Actually, now I wish I had some. There was a freeze plant, and what they essentially did is they froze the ground around the tanks to try to create this kind of ice ring around it to keep the LNG within the tank. That didn't work, and that was back in the 60s. That was abandoned, and that's exactly why Tank A and Tank B were constructed. But Tank A and B were constructed on the other side of the road, so absolutely can understand why you wouldn't want to build a new storage tank on top of the fill that they used to backfill the old tanks. Those tanks are no longer in service. They haven't been in service since the early 70s. Tank A and Tank B and Tank C were built on kind of greenfield area that had not been previously disturbed. We do have tank foundation heating systems. So when they build the tank foundation, it's a big concrete pad, no different than your house, the foundation of your house. It's off the ground. I think the tank chimes are probably about 1 foot off the ground, 1.5 feet off the ground. And there are pipes that go through the foundation. I don't know, maybe 50 pipes or 40 pipes. And inside of each one of these pipes is a heating element, just as you described, and it really isn't very much different than your oven. That heating element does burn up over time, and they have to be replaced. So one of the maintenance things that we do is we remove those, and on Tank B, we just did this as part of those upgrades. And it can be done with a tank in service. I think it's in the foundation, and so they're accessible. We pull them right out the side of the foundation. And so there's, several dozen of them. I think tanks are usually designed so...
Foundation is above grade.
Yes, so...
They're not buried.
Yes, so the foundation's about 1 foot off. Go ahead.
Okay, so look at it like this. The ground around the tank, that's it down there. And this is the foundation, the concrete foundation we're standing on, right? So we have access to all the conduits and the instruments that's connected to the temperature elements that goes through, right? So we have the ability to maintain all of these heaters, and we have a preventative maintenance system in place, which requires us to maintain these over a certain period. And if we don't, right, it's flagged, right? And we have a certain, I would say a few days, right, before we need to do it. And if we don't, then we're out of compliance. And we have always been following our preventative maintenance plan, right? So the concrete foundation, it's above ground. It allows us to easily access all the heating elements. And also, the heaters aren't connected to the tank, I would say the actual liquid at all. It's to keep the foundation warm to prevent frost heaves.
Does that help?
I think I'm still having some confusion, sorry. Do you guys want to ask questions?
Go ahead.
Okay. So again, the foundation is on the side and the tank is underground? Is that?
Top of the foundation.
The tank is on top of the foundation, but you have access to the foundation from the side.
The foundation's
But-
above ground as well,
The foundation is above ground,
and the
okay.
tank is on top of it. So there's about a foot above ground of the foundation, and that's where the heating elements go through.
So the pipes which are coming out of the tank and these heating elements, how often are they like replaced? And I mean, I'm sure you'll have to replace them, not just maintain them.
So they are, all the heating elements, again, we have a preventative maintenance program in place. So they are tested every year as per code, right? If any is found to be defective, it is replaced instantly. As well, we have a monitoring program in place. So we know the foundation temperature. If a temperature goes off, it's investigated, right? And if corrective maintenance needs to take place, it is done immediately.
Okay, great. So another question is regarding what like DPU mentions on the website, I think it's PHMSA, that any tank built after March 2001 will, if they make any changes, they have to be to the current code. But because these tanks were built at a time when those regulations did not exist, that is the reason this has been grandfathered in. So the changes that are done periodically, whether it's replacing the pipes, which I'm hoping has been done at some point, right? The pipes coming out of the tank itself, do they have to be as per the current code? Because I assume that when the tanks were built, maybe the pipe sizes and, they may not be existent now. So they have to be per the current code, right?
Do you want to address that? Because, I mean, certainly anything that we do that's new, right? So when we replace piping, if we don't put it back exactly the way that we found it, we would replace it meeting the modern day code, and we do that consistently. So the new liquefier is fully compliant with all the modern day code. The existing stuff, do you want to kind of talk through that and how that works?
But the liquefier, the liquefier is the one which you're talking on the other side of the road. But because the vaporizer and liquefier which were on the east side, which is right next to the tank, they are non-functional right now, right? Or the vaporizer is still?
The vaporizers are still functional. Those are on the uphill side.
Okay.
The existing, I'm going to say existing liquefier, but the original liquefier is still functional, although we're hoping to be able to use the new one starting this summer here shortly.
Okay. We were thinking that they're already functional and this one is fully closed.
No, so the original liquefier is I think currently will be running this week or is currently running, and that's why you see the flaring. So right now you probably see the flaring up top. That, when the new system is running, that'll go away. You won't see that flaring anymore.
And apart from the tanks, what else is there on this side of the road?
So you've got the 3 storage tanks. In this picture, you've got the guard shack. You'll see kind of in the background there is some loading bays. That's where we load the LNG storage trucks. And those we use to fill our Acushnet facility, which is a much smaller facility. And then you have the liquefier. The new liquefier equipment is those kind of new beige-colored, tan-colored buildings back there.
On the other side?
On this side of the road. Yep.
Okay. So in your interview, you had mentioned that because the tanks are at 110% capacity, you refer to the code 193 CFR and NFPA 59A, I believe. You mentioned that the tanks, if they are at 110%, like in terms of pressure, right? Because these are storage tanks, are they always up to that pressure? Because if they have to be to that pressure, to maintain that pressure, it has to be boiled off, and there would be some of the LNG would escape into the air, based on what I have read. So how is it maintained to that pressure all the time, and is it maintained to that pressure throughout the year? Because if this is a peak shaving plant, I'm assuming that it's not used all the time.
So in New England, the peak shaving facilities are used significantly more than other locations throughout the country. So we visited a facility, brand new facility in Arizona last year. I don't think have run more than a day or two, and that's primarily just based on the weather. So in New England, we regularly cycle the tanks because there's just that need. So what happens, you said 110, and we were talking pressure, but really what we're talking about is volume, right? So the tank is filled to generally about this elevation, and that represents about 100% of its fill. We typically, during a season, would go somewhere between, we don't really go less than 20% because we don't want the tanks to warm up. So say it goes between 15, 20%, and 100%. That's where we fill, and that's where we work within. This dome area, as you indicated, is what would collect what we call boil-off gas. So as the liquid sits there during the summer, it warms up a little bit, and a certain amount of LNG at the top will turn back into gas, and that will collect up at the top, and that begins to pressurize the tank. Our tanks operate at less than 1 pound of pressure. And so what we do is we draw with a compressor, with a pipe that comes off down, and we draw that boil-off gas so that it cannot pressurize up there. And we take that, we compress it, we put it back into the distribution system where it then goes to your house to be used in your stove. We do not vent that to atmosphere. We do that if there was an emergency and the boil-off gas compressors, for whatever reason, failed. We have redundancy there, so it's very uncommon. But we do have the ability to vent it if we had to. But generally speaking, there should be no venting of methane to the air for those tanks. Did I answer that question? I want to make sure, because I think there's some misunderstandings. I want to make sure it's clear, that I'm hitting the things that you're looking for.
I mean, we are not experts, so
understand.
there's only very little we can understand.
Yep.
But one last question that I have, again, my friends here are going to ask. So when I was talking to one of the planning board personnel, I guess a person working with the planning board, I'll say that, he mentioned that there are leaks happening all the time near these facilities, whether it's the liquefaction or the tanks. Is that normal? Because there are lots of pipes underground and close by, and we have these humongous pipe with, yellow signs everywhere. Do leaks happen on a normal basis? Because there are kids who are playing, and lots of people walk around with their cell phones, and little bit of LNG can actually cause can ignite with a small spark. So what protections should we take if there are small leaks happening around? We do smell gas a couple of times throughout the day. And as I have a child with asthma, and I'm always concerned what I'm exposing him to. And, so that's a concern.
So let me start the conversation, but I think you can talk more to what do you do about fugitive emissions and how do you monitor. So the facility itself has gas detection throughout it. You don't see that in distribution piping out in the street. They do monitor it. You'll see our trucks driving around and they're sweeping, looking for where there might be leaks. I won't say there's no leaks at the facility as far as, when you turn a valve, sometimes a little bit will come out as you're rotating it. That's, there's packing associated valve. That's how that works. But not, we don't have leaks that, would have substantial amount of gas leaking. And what we do as a company and as at an LNG facility, we're mandated to have gas detection. And so we have fixed sensors throughout the facility, quite a few of them, many dozens of them, that are specifically there to identify if there is any methane in the air. So we monitor that continuously, and we get alarms related to that. And we alarm at very, very sensitive levels. We have perimeter monitoring in certain areas so that if there was a gas leak, it would pick that up. So we not only monitor within the process area next to the equipment so that we immediately can detect it and shut down the equipment and address it, but we also do it at certain areas throughout the facility's perimeter. As far as maintenance, that very much falls into kind of what we do on a regular basis related to maintenance. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Okay. So as it relates to maintenance, again, we have a part of our preventative maintenance program. We have in place PMs that our techs basically check all our flanges, they check our valves, and if a leak is detected, it is immediately corrected and reported. And at the LNG facility, as Jim mentioned, leaks are very minimal. Pipes, we don't have pipes that are leaking. We have never had pipes that are leaking. A valve, yep, if you open a valve, sometimes you might have a bit of blow by, but it's correct. It can be corrected by a simple maintenance activity. Again, we also have various detectors. We have fire detectors, we have temperature detectors, both low temperature and high temperature detectors. And with the gas detectors, gas detectors can trigger an automatic shutdown. Fire detectors can trigger an automatic shutdown if certain conditions are met as well.
One thing, so I mentioned that the new liquefier will generally eliminate the flares on the ones that you see, the two that we have up top. The reason that those structures will remain and we're not going to be taking those down is because all of the relief valves, and the relief valve is there so if a pipe overpressurizes for whatever abnormal condition, the relief valve will open and that'll vent off that pressure. It's a safety device throughout the facility. At many facilities, that vents just to atmosphere, and then that gas would just dissipate into the atmosphere. At our facility, we have the flares, and we collect those relief devices. We collect the vents of those. I won't say every single one, because there's a couple that cannot go into that type of a system, but generally speaking, 90+% of our relief valves get collected, and they go to those flares. So while the flares operate regularly today because of the existing liquefier, and that'll be something that you won't see regularly, we'll continue to maintain them because of the safety devices that don't regularly operate. We still need a place for those to safely discharge to, and when they do discharge, the benefit of having flares, while they're a little bit of an inconvenience and they're a little bit of an eyesore and people don't like the look of them, the reality is those collect any methane that gets vented and we safely burn it off. One, that eliminates the concern with it catching fire. It eliminates the smell related to it, and it helps reduce the greenhouse gas emissions related to the facility. So the flare will remain. You won't see it actively. You shouldn't see it actively running up there, but that will remain. And the new facility, we do the same thing. We have a much smaller flare over there, but it's primarily just to collect the relief valves. Probably what you do smell, I won't say that you don't smell any methane over there, because I know there has been, certain circumstances at the facility over the past 50 years, and I think there was one a couple years ago where there was a relief valve that was one of the few that's not tied to the flare header that did relieve, and we did have quite a few, I think, odor calls related to the facility. However, what you regularly do smell right now is, as those flares are used for the normal liquefaction process, and that's just part of the normal process, you do smell some of that flare burning. And again, as we eliminate that with the new liquefier, you should not, you won't have that smell anymore. So while you do probably smell, I won't say you haven't smelled methane in the past, it's primarily probably driven by the flare, and we're looking to eliminate that. So hopefully you'll recognize a perceivable difference in that, that smell or that odor that you perhaps detect more frequently now.
Can I add one thing on your comment on leaks? You guys did a great job answering that, but like you mentioned, solid welded pipe doesn't leak. If you get a leak, it's from a valve stem packing or an interface. And most of the times you need to be a foot or two away with a gas detector, which is set to detect a fraction of the lower flammability limit before you can even detect the leak. So your concern is being, what if I'm outside with a cell phone, or I have a bonfire in my backyard? The leaks are not dispersing more than inches in some cases, maybe feet in most cases. So when you get these packing leaks, and they're so microscopic that they're not going more than a few inches to a few feet away.
I have several questions about safety. I'm noticing the safety first and always up there, so it's good. First question is, did you collaborate with the Hopkinton public safety officials to design an evacuation plan for the town? And if so, will that be shared with residents at some point?
Can I phone a friend on this one? He volunteered. He said he was going to sit in the back, but he did volunteer if I had any real tough questions. Now, Peter, you and I talked earlier, and I said you would ask me as many questions as I was going to be willing to answer. You had your opportunity.
I only have a few more.
However, Josh here is responsible for planning our emergency preparedness, has been working an awful lot with Chief Miller and the other first responders in town, so I'll let him take this one.
All right, thanks, Jim. As Jim said, I'm Josh White. I'm the manager of gas emergency preparedness. Prior to joining Eversource, I'm 20 years active duty military, worked with FEMA Region 1 out of Boston, a lot of federal experience, and been with Eversource about 7 years at this point. I'm getting a lot of feedback up here. What's that? All right. So the discussion about the evacuation plan. We work very closely with public safety. Nervous sitting up in front of all you guys. So within that process, we have an emergency response plan. We work very closely to make sure how the response happens, how the notification process happens, is done in conjunction with fire department, police department, all of that process. So the actual outside evacuation plan is the responsibility of the fire department. And we work with them to help understand all of the potential scenarios to help them plan that process, if that makes sense.
So to clarify, the fire department would be sharing that with residents at some point.
And I'll let Chief Miller talk to that. Yeah, sorry.
Good evening. Again, Chief Miller, Hopkinton Fire. Peter, you're asking about the hazard mitigation plan, basically is what you're asking about. And the plan is in the process of being updated. It has to be updated, I believe, if it's every 5 years. We're due to cycle that through. We do have some drafts of it. The plan does have in place evacuation routes. However, it can't be etched in stone because we have to be flexible. Every emergency we go to is dynamic, and we have to be flexible, we have to be fluid, and this is no different. Whatever the incident is how we're going to adapt and how we're going to potentially do an evacuation if need be.
And what I will say is I've been in many meetings with Chief Miller, before him Chief Slamman, and all the officers that you have in the group. We have spent a lot of time talking through different scenarios. So to both their points, it's a very fluid, it could be a fluid situation, and so we've talked to all different types of scenarios, tried to educate, all parties involved of this is what our equipment is, these are the types of things that we see that could potentially take place, these are the locations on site of fire equipment that we have at site, here's the locations of specific pieces of equipment, here's some high voltage equipment, you wouldn't want to put water on that. We've spent a lot of time with the department trying to educate them on the facility. And I know there had been previously some comments about, well, we're really appreciative and happy that the fire department and the company have worked together to do this big drill that we did this last month. But we wish we had been doing more stuff, or we wish there had been other things taking place. We've been training with them every year. There's site walkthroughs. There's quite a few, tabletop type exercises. We may not do formal tabletop exercise, but we at least talk through the different types of scenarios and how would you respond. And, I think you guys have discussed, how far, how do we monitor with the extent of, whatever we have to keep track of, and to what extent do we potentially evacuate folks. And so we've talked through that type of stuff. So it tends to be very fluid, though.
And to be clear, it's not just Hopkins PD, right? It's all of the mutual aid communities that would be a part of that. So there are situations where Hopkinton may not be the first responding department. So we want to make sure any mutual aid asset, any of our community partners from Framingham, Ashland, all have that same information as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like you guys have done a lot of talking, and that's great, and a lot of education, and a lot of training, and a lot of planning. When I was a kid and there would be an earthquake drill, I would sit under my desk, and they would make me do that every year, a couple of times a year. No one in this room has ever heard anything from you or the fire department about what they maybe should think about if they heard a siren. Is there even a siren? Is there even a warning? Is there anything that would tell people that there's kind of a problem and they should kind of run the opposite direction?
So within the facility, the ability, the potential of having to evacuate deals with a lot of absolute worst case, right? My job is to look at the very most, devastating consequence. That's what I'm paid to do. Now, when you start to think about that, first thing is, I don't want to scare you. When we look at risk management, you have the likelihood and the severity of the impact. They're typically opposite of each other. You're talking about, a very, very small potential of this occurring.
I got to cut you off. Are you essentially saying that you're not going to share it because you don't want to scare people? And that's why you haven't shared? I think I just heard, I don't mean to be confrontational, but I heard you say you don't want to scare people, so.
I want to be clear that I say how I do my planning, how we developed our, the exercise in conjunction with the fire department, bordered on beyond realistic.
Okay. That, in your professional opinion, the worst case scenario that the consultants described was beyond realistic?
No, what I said is my scenario that I developed for that exercise would be extremely hard to produce real life.
Okay.
Okay.
What consultant are we talking about, though? Because if you're referencing prior reports that were done, I would say that they were completely unrealistic and certainly not something that we would have trained or tried to drill to, because there was not a scenario that we believe that we would be knocking on the door or sending an alarm out and that folks in the community should be running. So we don't want to scare people because we don't think it's realistic. We don't think that that's one of the scenarios.
The Hopkinton Select Board commissioned a study to produce it, and what I hear you saying is you don't believe that study was realistic.
If we're talking about the original one that then was a secondary report that was produced by the same group to refute that?
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. I'm sorry.
So So are you talking about
So
the report?
in the briefing to the Hopkinton Select Board in 2019, then Fire Chief Slayman produced a report that said, this is what our consultants say is the worst case scenario. And that worst case scenario had a photo or an overlay, a topographical overlay that showed a cloud of blue. You know which one I'm talking about, right? And what I'm trying to understand is if your professional opinion, Jim, is that is not realistic.
Is this the one that had a multi-mile radius around the facility?
Can I just add?
Yeah, if it is convenient, we have that in the slide, we can show it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead.
I think what Peter Thomas here is referring to is the Smith and Burgess report. I understand that it was refuted by, I guess it's Sanford or Sanborn, I forget the other company's name. But here's the thing, right? When that report was written and the other company which refuted, they mentioned that the wind condition and the forest condition, and the trees blocking the wind wasn't taken into consideration. But now there are barely any trees. Right in my backyard, all the trees were cut out for the new construction to on-go. So there is a lot of wind. I understand that it was a worst case scenario, and there's a very remote chance that it can ever happen, right? A catastrophe of that magnitude can ever happen. But catastrophes do happen. And in my presentation, I had slides showing that the Williams pipeline, which is I think in Washington, in 2014, there was an incident. And there was a newspaper article which said that the vapor cloud was actually seen from the space. Again, when I looked at the Smith and Burgess report, and I was trying to look at all the other reports, methane cloud spotted near Oklahoma natural gas. There's a picture, it looks identical to Smith and Burgess. Again, Florida pipeline, clue in mystery of a giant methane leak. That was also in Bloomberg. Also, New Mexico's methane hotspot, largely, again, that one, the same thing. Georgia pipeline, methane, that was also methane. All of this was, seen from the space and looked very much identical to Smith and Burgess report. We totally understand where you're coming from, that there's a remote chance that there might be an incident, but having, like Peter mentioned, if there is an earthquake, the kids are trained, and in California, children also know that they need to run. But here, if there's an LNG cloud, to be frank, the first thing that you mentioned, it's a colorless, odorless gas, right? But someone with asthma will really suffer. Someone with pneumonia may die because they are inhaling this colorless, odorless gas. They don't even know that they are inhaling this, right? So I don't know how much it's going to smell. I'm not an expert on this, but I think it all boils down to letting people know that there is an incident. Of course, there will be people who will freak out and who will create a ruckus, but I think we all have to be trained because we live close to the tanks. Everyone in the town lives close to the tank, to be frank. Everyone in Hopkinton needs to be trained. The children need to know what they need to do if they hear a certain type of sound, what direction, again, the direction of the wind flow, all of this, the people need to know. People need to know.
So if I can answer the question before you kind of cut me off. What I was going to say is that you're right, it is odorless, it is colorless. We work and have the process where we have an immediate notification, when we have an event especially to the scale you're talking about, through 911 for an immediate response from FD. We have additional assets from the gas company that we bring in to help monitor, working with fire department, and track where that gas migration may go. Then we work with the police department for any necessary evacuations if the weather conditions, if everything was absolutely against us. That's where we have these plans to work with public safety and safely evacuate if that is absolutely necessary.
So it's great that you guys are collaborating so well now, because that has not always been the historical case. So I'm glad to hear you say that. And you know, as we say goodbye to our chief, I'm sure deputy chief, now acting chief, you're going to continue to collaborate with the Hopkinton Fire very closely on this. It's great.
You know, we spend a lot of time, we've developed a lot of plans. You know, we look forward to continuing to do that.
That's great.
Continuing to do our annual training and exercises, maybe not to the scale of what you saw, you know, a couple of weeks ago, but as Jim said, we do this every year.
That's great. So if there were a major fire, just, you know, at the plant, is the control room hardened or the operators incentivized to leave to protect their own lives?
Yeah, so as you and I talked on the interview, and I don't know that that made it into the actual video that was posted, but the existing control room resides in the upper plant portion. So we can operate the facility from that location. As we move, that current location is kind of in the middle of the existing liquefier, which again is being retired. So that now will be in a somewhat remote location on site as compared to what it is today. So that'll certainly be improved. We would have the ability, you know, if the operator did have to leave the control room, the facility is designed where we would emergency shut down the facility. All the systems would go into a safe condition. And so the operator could absolutely, in order to ensure their safety, leave the control room and still get the plant into a safe condition. We do now, with the new local control room as associated with the new facility, be able to also operate much of the equipment from there as well.
That's great.
And to follow that as well, our processes, our procedures, if that were to happen, is we meet the public safety officials responding to the incident and escort them onto the site. We practiced that a couple of weeks ago. So worst case, where they had to evacuate a control room, we are still meeting. As Jim said, you've got the plant shutdowns, you've got the other automated systems, and we're escorting FD into the site.
Yep, that's
The other thing too is, as we discussed, right, it hasn't come to fruition yet, but we will likely be in front of planning board here in the coming year related to building a new control building kind of over in the field area that we used on the other side of the road. That'll be very much remote to all of the process facility, and that will be where we'll operate the facility in the future.
I have just 2 questions left. Thank you, guys. So has anyone ever run the as-built design from the 60s through a modern stress test or seismic analysis? I mean, computers have evolved quite a bit since the 1960s when the plans were designed by hand. I think you just mentioned drawings, right? So has anyone ever done that? Do we know how it would hold up?
No, we've never done that. I don't know that tank design today is that far different, but we have not done that, no.
Is that something that you guys could commit to doing?
I don't think, we'd have to discuss that internally, but I'm not sure that we could commit to that one way or, I mean, we'd have to talk about that, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure, we'd have to discuss that internally.
And I will say, with seismic, my team, myself, we're all registered for all of our LNG facilities and monitor USGS every day. So whenever there is an earthquake notification, as soon as USGS posts that, which is typically near real time or within the hour, we're analyzing that. Looking at the depth, looking at the magnitude, looking at the location. We've never had an earthquake within miles of the site since I've been with the company that would create any type of concern. We have seen earthquakes southeast Mass, where we see impacts to other infrastructure, whether it be water, gas, electric, but nothing within the plants, anything within the magnitude or scale at this point that would drive, major concerns.
Yet. And also, I mean, we used to build cars and not crash test them, but now we do crash test them. So, I mean, there is value in modeling how these tanks will withstand a major seismic event, which I concede has not happened yet, but could happen.
I think there's also a perception that modern code is somehow necessarily more conservative than some of the standards that were originally utilized, and that's not the case in all instances. So I don't know, I'm not suggesting that changes kind of what you're discussing, but, you know, we see this in the piping code. The piping code that we're following related to the facility, even in the modern version, is an older version because it is more conservative than the modern code. So design pressures or testing pressures are actually higher in the older code versus today. So don't let there be a perception that just because it's a new version or a new design that it's somehow more robust than some of the original designs.
Well, I mean, you may be right.
You see that in house construction as well, right?
Yeah, but I have also driven a 1960s car and I've driven a 2023 car, and I know they're different. And I'm assuming that if I were to build this facility today, there would be some modification. This would not be the exact design, would it?
I absolutely agree with you.
Okay.
But I would also suggest that a modern car does not last nearly as long as many of the older versions, right?
Sure. All right, so that's fine. I think that would be a good thing for you guys to, you know, talk about, whether that you could get that done. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So I just want to add that for seismic activities that are felt within the area, we have a procedure that's carried out. We do visual inspection of our systems, and we also have a third-party contractor come in and do its tank foundation surveys as well.
On the seismic side, you usually wouldn't do that unless there is something that changed in the seismic activity, because when you develop your response spectra, if there's been no new faults or other things, your probabilistic and deterministic method might give you the same exact response, because when you're doing these, you're looking at return periods of 2,500 years, 5,000, 10,000 years. So unless there's been a significant change on the subsurface conditions, your seismic response spectra could be the same for numerous years.
But I concede that, but no one's ever done one, so how do we even know? Literally no one has ever done the seismic analysis of this facility. Not in the 60s and not in 2023. So how would we really know?
If there's been no change to the subsurface conditions, your response spectra of the original design might still be the same that is right now. So usually when you would reassess something, there would be some sort of, hey, USGS has noticed there's these minor other activities which are more frequent than the original response period. Let's reassess these to see what our spectra look and see what those are. But to my understanding, there's been no inclination. So the reason nobody's done that is there's been no reason to do it. There's been nothing suggesting, hey, we're seeing changes in ground motions or other things which might warrant that type of analysis.
Oftentimes, we don't build a guardrail until a school bus full of children drives over the embankment. But we also have an opportunity to build a guardrail before, and doing some computer modeling, I mean, would seem, you know, easy, feasible, reasonable even.
You wouldn't remodel if the spectra is the same.
But
Yeah.
you're suggesting that there isn't.
I'm saying perform a simulated computer analysis. I'm not saying go build a concrete foundation or do anything to change the facility. I'm saying run the plans. I'm sorry, I'm not the only computer programmer in the room, am I?
Yeah.
I just took a random guess. I mean, this is like basic stuff. This isn't hard, right? Like take the plans, run them through a simulator. That's all. Don't change anything about the facility. Don't, you know what I mean? I'm just saying, okay, anyway, we'll move on. Without disclosing anything that you shouldn't, and I'm not asking you to, can you provide residents some measure of confidence about your use of outsourced security at the facility who seem to be kind of, and I'm going to put this politely, not very invested? You've all read the article, I assume.
Okay, so
What have you done since then, I guess is the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as it relates to security, yes, we do outsource security providers. What we have done, we have changed the provider because we weren't satisfied with how they were
When was
operating.
that?
And that was probably 4 or 5 months ago. And we're currently evaluating the current security providers. Now, we have taken steps to get them to improve their performance. We have spoken with the contractors. We're in dialogue with our internal corporate security, and already we are seeing improvements.
But let's just clarify something. What you're talking about, though, are the guards that you see out on the roadway. That's only one layer. We don't outsource security. We have our own internal security group and program. So that's one of the many layers of security at the site. So let's not kind of confuse that, right? You're talking specifically about kind of the roving guards that we have, but that's only one group related to security that, is engaged at that facility.
Thank you. I have a few questions. Thanks for answering patiently so far. So I think you talked about modernization of the tank B. I'm just going to go back to the tanks a little bit. The thermal events and the cracks, did they occur after the modernization, or is it when did that happen, and what was done to fix it?
So there were no cracks. I want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page, because I know there was some confusion. So the thermal anomaly on tank B, we identified in 2017 is when it first. So from that time, we took the tank out of service. We reviewed kind of what was taking place there. The repairs that were made as the tank was out of service, again, was related to fixing the temperature measuring device and the moisture that was getting in from there. So we did correct that. But there were no fixes related to, cracks or anything like that. That was not anything that we found in the tank.
Yeah, and I think, related to that, I think my overall question is, so do you report these kind of events to the public safety? I mean, I'm sure that you don't want to alarm the citizens for every small event, but what is what kind of events are communicated to the local public safety and fire safety? Are they aware of this? And if so, with what frequency do you communicate these kind of events?
Do you want to talk to, kind of current communication, that type of thing?
Okay, so in relation to communication of abnormal or AOCs, we have an internal protocol that's followed, and if it is depending on the magnitude of the abnormal operating condition, right, then the process is followed and it escalates. Something like the anomaly in the tank, those are communicated to the regulators. And that's done twice per year. We also, the fire department, they would have direct communication with the plant staff, with the plant superintendent, if there was an anomaly where we deemed it would cause some, I would say, it was deemed necessary to have them involved. Outside of that, once an alarm goes off at the facility, the fire department knows and they're turning up to the facility, and we have to give an explanation as to what it was.
So, and these these protocols are by code, or is it Eversource made, and is it collaborated, or is it agreed upon by the fire department that, okay, is it like level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? What you think is level 1 is probably level 4 for them. So is it agreed upon by all parties, like the experts?
Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of, yes, it's agreed upon. It's a combination of what's required by the regulators, Eversource, and the fire department.
And the regulators, the department that you're talking about is which one here?
So mainly the Department of Public Utility, there is PHMSA, and then there is FERC.
So this facility is regulated really by three primary entities related to LNG. There's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. There's PHMSA, which is the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. And then there's the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities Pipeline Safety Division. there's certain thresholds of types of events that we would have to notify them. There is, annual reporting and such, but certain events, we would have to notify them within so many hours. So, we have those kind of regulatory thresholds or that code requirements. Maybe on perhaps a more informal basis, we've recognized over the last few years the sensitivity that the town has to the facility. We have a much improved relationship with the fire department and first responders. It's not uncommon if there is some type of noise or something like that at this point in time, we receive a phone call, any time of the night, quite honestly, from the chief. It's saying, hey, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but we just want to make sure that we stay ahead of it. So we are in regular communication to the point now that even for much of our construction activities, we're providing a weekly update saying, hey, next week, we intend on doing A, B, and C activity at site. There might be a little bit of, you might see some cranes on site, that type of thing. So we've really increased the amount of communication between us and the town, recognizing, and that's not a legal requirement by any way, we just recognize that there is a sensitivity. We have other towns that they really have no interest in being involved in the day-to-day. In Hopkinton, we recognize that there is more sensitivity. There's more people around us here. Waterbury, we're in the middle of a city. The plant's surrounded by it, but they seem to not have the same level of interest, and that's okay. That's just, they have other priorities. But here, there's a higher level of sensitivity, and we've really kind of, in the last few years, really embraced that. So I think, now if there's a small incipient fire, which we have not had at the facility, but we would report that. We've discussed that. We would let them know, hey, you didn't need to respond. It was a rag that caught fire. We put it out immediately. But we would let them know. In past situations, we may not let them know that because we didn't need fire response. But we would today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And I think, as I think many people have mentioned before, right? For us, I think, it would be good to learn. I mean, for the most part, the Hopkinton LNG gas facility is kind of a black box for us, right? We know that, you guys have done a lot of work on it. I think, but we always have to be sure, like, since there's zero communication from the Hopkinton this facility about any kind of events or any kind of anomaly or what kind of safety procedures has done, I think we'll be always under that kind of this anxiety about, okay, what is done? Is it safe? Has there been any kind of recent reviews? Has there been any kind of recent inspections going on? I think so. If there is a way that you could make it, or you or the city or the town together could make that available to the public, that will assuage some of the fears that we have.
So one thing that is available to the public, I believe, are the FERC reports. Is that correct? The FERC PHMSA inspections. So, because we are regulated by 3 entities, I mean, there's other regulators as well, Mass DEP, I don't want to dismiss that, but they don't, those groups tend to look at other things. But FERC PHMSA DPU, I asked our compliance supervisor to send me the info the other day, and I think we're on a multi-year requirement. That's a semi-annual inspection. I think that for the last 6 or 7 years, we've had 2 agencies on site each year performing audits. So that's actually a little bit more than that. And that's probably driven mostly by the construction, because obviously if they see an increase of activity at a site, they want to put more eyes on it. So we do get probably more than the normal occurrence of audits and inspections by those 3 regulatory groups. And I believe that with FERC, our kind of annual reporting to them or semi-annual reporting to them is a public document, and something that, we provide them feedback on the types of things that we're doing on site. And so, there is a level of transparency there. I recognize folks generally aren't aware of that, but that information is available out there.
And does it cover all aspects of the inspection, or is it some aspect of it, or the entire
I think they're generally kind of summarized findings of what they have, and quite honestly, I think we've been very successful. We have, an organization within the LNG group specific that's dedicated. I think you have 3 individuals who are responsible just for compliance for his 3 facilities. And so we've been very successful at making sure that when they visit the site, we have the proper documentation, procedures, folks have the proper qualifications, we have that documented, recorded, and we're up to date with all that. So they summarize that, they come in, they do a very thorough audit, they usually here for a full week, and their findings, typically have been pretty minimal. And, I think that, those are 3 regulatory bodies that, as citizens, they're actually out there doing their job. They're regularly performing inspections, and we should, get some level of comfort, hopefully, from that.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think I think the missing piece is, okay, they would have recommended some, okay, XYZ is missing, or you could do this or that. How are those communicated? Or, I mean, you guys would know that, but how do we know? What have you done to address those? And, what's the timeline if you are going to address those?
Yeah, so I think there's regulatory requirements over the timeline. We don't publish, hey, FERC was out here last month and here's their findings. That's not something that we kind of, I'll say, push out to the public, because most folks wouldn't have that interest. Obviously here, there's more of a sensitivity to that. However, again, when they come back to do, or when we actually report on our semi-annual, we would kind of address, we had these findings at the prior audit, and these are the issues that we corrected, and here's, a summary of what took place.
So yeah, I think if the public has a way of learning that, that'll be great. That's all.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, my next question would be about the air quality. Of course, the discussions that we had right now obviously focuses on the air quality of the surroundings, and from the articles that we have read when we were researching about this, was that the permit expired passed in 2017. So, and we do not know if there is a new air quality test ever done to ensure it. And this was also brought up with the select board members when we first requested the public forum. So I just wanted to hear from Eversource, do you have a plan of how the air quality is managed and stuff? Do you guys look into it?
Yeah, so the air permit related to the facility did have an expiration date, which came and went. It also had within the air permit, which is very common for air permits issued by Mass DEP, a requirement that the facility or the owner submits their renewal application, I think within 6 months of the air permit expiring. We have an environment, Eversource, as you can imagine, has a large environmental group. We have an individual who's very specifically dedicated to air permits for the company. They were on top of that. We have a consultant that specifically aggregates all the information for the facility and puts that permit application together, and we did have that submitted, within the 6-month deadline, I think it was. Unfortunately, Mass DEP tends to be a little bit slow and delay with responding to those and getting new permits issued. This is Jim Blackburn's opinion, but if they've got a permit that hasn't, if nothing's changed at the facility and the company continues to supply the data that's requested and everything's in conformance with the original permit, they probably have other, in their minds, maybe important things that are more immediate, so those do tend to be delayed. But we are fully compliant with our air permit, despite the fact that the date for the expiration is come and gone. We did submit the renewal application, and I suspect it's probably a matter of time that we'll receive the updated paperwork.
So what is the frequency of the testing that you do for air quality?
So it's dependent on, there's a whole section within that air permit, which should be public. Different pieces of equipment have a certain testing frequency. I think the vaporizers we have to test on, I think we have to do one every year or something along those lines. We have to bring a trailer in, a third party comes in and monitors the emissions from the stacks and confirms that it's, consistent with the original design criteria that we had submitted to Mass DEP. But it's different for all the equipment, so it's not, I won't say that I can dictate each one.
I just heard from the facility, for this facility that we are talking about, it should be done annually, correct?
Certain equipment.
Oh, certain equipment.
Yeah, not all equipment is, so there's certain equipment that doesn't maybe receive the stack testing that other pieces, major pieces of equipment do. They might be smaller, minor sources. But what they do require, and that we do on a monthly basis, is we aggregate data from all those pieces of equipment. So that might be the fuel consumption. So if you have a generator, just like your car, if you normally get 20 miles per gallon and then the next month you're getting 40 miles per gallon, something's not right with that engine. And so we, the same exact thing, report things like fuel usage, certain pieces of equipment, we monitor exhaust temperature, and that's information that tells you if the equipment's not operating as designed per the original air permit. And one, we would need to address that because there's a piece of, issue with the piece of equipment. And two, Mass DEP would want to know that to ensure that we didn't leave that unresolved and we're, not getting complete combustion, and so, the emissions from the facility is somehow degraded over time. So we do report that data, aggregate that data on a monthly basis. And then, that's something that Mass DEP, I'm sure, takes into consideration as they review the permit application that, is back before them.
Okay, so once the permit, yes. So once the permit, I know you submitted the application and so forth. So once it's done, would that be available publicly to?
Would that be?
The permit, would that be available publicly?
Yeah, my understanding is Mass DEP has e-place portal or something like that. You can go to their website.
Yeah, I get it.
I'm telling you right now, it's not easy to navigate, but the information is in there.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
I just want to add to that. So my name is James Arena DeRosa. I'm the state representative for Hopkinton, live in Holliston. Thank you for coming out, first of all. And it is confusing because there's so many different regulators involved in this facility. And I'm going to talk to just the piece that just came up. And then I have a question about safety, but maybe I'll step down and get back to that one. So you're correct. It's very confusing, and the community had asked me to look into this issue of the permit. It says right on the permit, expires August 17th, 2017. And I looked at it, I said the same thing. I'm like, oh my God, they're out of compliance, but they're not. Because Eversource, within the 6 months, did apply for the renewal, and everything is still in force, and you're absolutely right on that piece of it. What I wanted to point out to the community, and I can help with this, those reports are available to the public as the air quality is tested. I talked with the regional director for DEP yesterday. Those reports are available, and I can help you get those. I can help you navigate that. I can also help the community get the FERC reports, anything that's public, and it is sometimes hard to navigate those federal and state bureaucratic databases. So I'm just pledging that anything that they have said tonight that is available to the public, please be in touch with me, and I'm happy to get that for you. Irfan's going to have to understand the language and navigate it because he can understand what they mean. I can't tell you what they mean, but and I didn't know if you wanted to add to that. And then I have something on safety later, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow. But go ahead, Irfan. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I used to work at DEP, and I worked with Mary Jude Bigsley. So she called me yesterday, and we had a long conversation. One thing to understand about the permit, the air quality permit, is basically that they are permitting so Eversource submits a plan with all the equipment and lines them all up and says, okay, this is how it's going to operate. So that plan approval is what they are approving at DEP. And it is just the emissions from the vaporizer, the compressor and all that. That's what's in the air quality permit. It's not necessarily, from the entire facility itself. So a bit of a distinction. It is, yeah.
It's a huge difference, and it's about, it changes the equation, because what we are really interested is the air that we breathe in the community, and that's not focused.
So, yeah, so it's what the air quality permit is really looking at is just the equipment, the emissions from the equipment. Good to know that. Yeah, keep that in mind.
Yeah. But there is the different component of the pollution of that area itself. By the facility, which we care about.
Yes, but I don't think that's, and you guys can correct me, but I don't think that's part of the air quality permit.
Yeah, so that's what we are more worried about, and we would like to know.
So the vaporizers and the liquefaction tanks, right, they do release out some hazardous chemicals, and some of it includes like xylene, mercury, is that the case? And nitrous oxide, and some of them are quite hazardous. Even though the percentage may be very less, the quantity that is released in the air may be very, very less, but hazardous chemicals, especially mercury and xylene, are neurotoxins, and they can cause developmental, deformities and, brain-related disorders in children if it is at a higher level. So if there is a leak of some sort, there would be larger amount burnt, and lots of these toxic chemicals will be released in the air. And that has happened at the Dish facility in Texas, in Dish, Texas. I mean, Dish is a place in Texas. Yeah, so they have an LNG facility, and they have terrible air quality. The entire town is struggling with air quality. We don't want to be in that situation. That's the reason we're asking.
Yeah, so if you've ever traveled through Houston, it's an eye-opener related to the industry that you see, right? We certainly don't believe we're there here, and I don't think we ever intend to be a little Houston. The air permit, and I only know this is not my area of expertise, but because I managed the liquefier project, I had to delve into a lot of this with our consultants. But the air permit today at the facility is based upon both the existing equipment, including the liquefier, and the new liquefier. So we kind of right now are a little bit double dipping. We're probably a little bit over exaggerated on our actual emissions because we're taking account for two pieces of equipment. The old equipment will eventually go away. That'll help lower. The other thing to keep in mind is that when the air permit or the air plan, which is what I think what was referenced, right? So we submitted an air plan for approval. That's based on total potential to admit of certain emissions criterias, right? So that would be if we run certain pieces of equipment for, the total number of hours that we've committed that we will operate them under. So if the compressors are limited to 5,000 hours of operation, certainly when we put that plan together, we recognize that we never want to have a threshold that is just so tight that we may someday be kind of bumping up against that. So there's a lot of conservatism into those estimates. So while the plan may be based on a compressor running 5,000 hours of operation, we may only run that 2,500 hours or 3,000 hours. So hopefully what you'll recognize and what we'll see over the course of time here with the new equipment coming into service and with the existing plan approval that's in place or the permit that's in place is, we should be far lower than those, NOx levels or the emissions that we produce on an annual basis as compared to what's approved in that air plan approval. Mass DEP spent quite a bit of time. I think our air plan approval that was for the new portion of the facility, but included all the equipment, including the existing equipment on site. I think that process was almost a 2-year process with Mass DEP's central regional office. I know that the modeling associated with that was reviewed by their Boston office. So there was quite a bit of, review and back and forth between our company and Mass DEP to ensure that we were below all of the necessary thresholds. And that, new pieces of equipment, to the extent that was possible, like the new gas turbine, which will power the new liquefier, that's a low NOx emissions, ultra low NOx emissions gas turbine. So we invested extra money into all of these pieces of equipment to achieve, best available control technology. Obviously, some of the older equipment, we're going to try to retire that, and that'll eliminate some of those older emission sources, which are really gas-fired engines that just don't have that low NOx kind of capability. So we should see an improvement related to emissions with the new equipment that's on site.
Is it a proactive measure that Eversource is taking?
Ask in the mic so you don't.
Sorry. So is this a proactive measure that Eversource is taking to replace that old equipment with the new one, such that the environmental pollution, air quality, whatever is going to reduce? Or is it some sort of solution or the, equipment recommended by the authorities, like the regulatory bodies?
No.
And I have one follow-up question based on that.
Sure. So it was a calculated and thought out process. Part of Mass DEP's challenge to us is to apply best available control technology related to air emission sources. So when we purchased the gas turbine, there were models that were less expensive and more, available in the market that didn't have the same amount of, had higher thresholds of nitrous oxides and some of these other, CO and that type of thing. So we purposefully spent money, invested additional money into the equipment that we purchased to get lower NOx model units, and we do that.
Well, that's related to the equipment, I guess. Of course, it is connected to the equipment, no doubt, but it is the amount of flare the equipment is right now releasing. So there is a proactive approach that Eversource has taken to replace that equipment. Is it like sort of, inside out, or is it something recommended by the regulatory body?
No, it's inside out. So I keep going back to the liquefier because that's the new equipment, and that makes up the bulk. That will make up the bulk of the facility in the future for the process. The new equipment or the new liquefier that we chose is based on a nitrogen refrigerant. So nitrogen is, primarily a component of the air we breathe. It is not as efficient as other liquefaction technology, meaning we have to use a little bit more energy to produce liquid at a less efficient rate by using the nitrogen refrigeration system. However, the trade-off is the other technology used to liquefy LNG tends to be using hydrocarbons as the refrigerant, so propane, ethylene, methane, some mixtures of that. Those have more emissions related to them because when you trip the plant, you have to vent that to the flare, or many facilities don't have a flare and they just vent that to atmosphere. At our facility, we made a conscious effort to go with a nitrogen cycle refrigeration system because we knew that produced perhaps slightly less efficient process, but had less emissions associated with refrigerant. So when we trip the plant, we will no longer have to burn that off in the flare. That's a significant amount of air emissions that's reduced by this new system. So that's not, I guess, in extent that is a piece of equipment, but the process, the overall liquefaction system throughout every decision that we made in there, emissions related to noise, pollutants, all of that was taken into consideration. We did invest money. We spent extra money to ensure that we had some of the best technology available.
Do we have any report that can support the facts not related to the equipment, but related to the air quality overall, pertaining to the pollution and the elements that are being released in the air with the current state? As a citizen, can I go and see somewhere?
I don't know that there's a report that's ever been commissioned, kind of, I guess, ambient air quality, I guess is what that might be. As part of the new air plan that was submitted for the liquefier, there was an analysis within that documentation that talks to, here's equipment that we could use, here's equipment that we did use, this is the benefit to it, there's a cost associated with that, but we understand that needs to be done.
I see.
I don't know that fully addresses the question, but that's, I think, the best I can offer here tonight.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, I'll adjust it again. Okay. Yeah, my question is, okay. So my question is about, your team, which takes care of the security aspects of the plant. Do you have any, I'm sure you have some kind of classification as to what is like safe and what is like the catastrophic level of those, in terms of safety. So at what stage does the mitigation system that we have in place with the lamps going to help us? I know it's not directly a question.
No, so I think we can address this because we've talked about this, and I know, this is a concern because anyone who's walked around in the community out there, through the paths in the back there, has observed that you're talking about the lanterns specifically, correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Yeah, so anyone who's seen them, almost from day one, those have not been working. And I think if you go over and walk them today, you'll see that there are several that are out, because many of my folks walk around that area at lunchtime. What I'll tell you is, as a company, and I won't speak for the town, but as a company, we internally have always agreed that it was not an appropriate measure to put in place. To us, that is one of the last decisions that you would ever make, is to purposefully ignite some form of a combustible moving, and light it back to the facility. So to us, that was not an appropriate measure. That's not something that you'll see within our industry anywhere throughout the country. That's our position. Certainly that wasn't something that we dictated, but that's, I think, our position. I think that's been...
Yeah, so part two to that question is, if that is the case, then is there anything else we can do? Because as it is, the big concern for all of us is like we are paying for those things to be there. And if it is not going to help us in any way, is there anything else we can pay for? Rather than doing that, if there is any sensor system or any kind of a remote monitoring which might help us.
Is there something that you could pay for? I think you'll like what I said. So is there something that you could pay for? Perhaps, but I don't think it's worth your investment. I think a better investment is to continue to foster the relationship between the company and the first responders to ensure that both parties are properly trained on the hazards of the facility, what those might be, what the realities and probabilities of those are, how to best respond to those. It's important that the two groups work together, so if there was some form of an incident, we can keep it contained to the site. And I think that's probably the best value, and I think that's something that you're already paying for in your tax, right? In the taxes that you pay, you're paying for the first responders and the professionals that you have in town to work with us and our professionals who, plan for this type of thing. And that's their daily. Josh is here by himself, but Josh has a group of multiple people with, very strong backgrounds in this type of preparation. I don't think that you as a community need to pay for anything more than what you're already paying in your taxes related to the first responders. Us as a company do continue to pay and invest in the facility in things like improved safety systems, gas detection, perimeter monitoring. We do things and have implemented new process systems within the piping systems, new valves that go closed quicker, valves that didn't exist previously that we've added to ensure that we can isolate sections of the facility. We've done things, to ensure that we limit the amount of flow of LNG under the road, because that's something that we've discussed in the past. We have shutdowns now that did not exist previously for the lines that went under the road, so that if there was ever some incident that took place, and it may not be that the line was somehow severed. It may just be that there's a fire on the road because there was an accident, because that's a fairly narrow street with the trees right up against the roadway. And we've seen many accidents along the roadway, just people texting and not paying attention. And I can remember multiple accidents that we've walked out there to try to help folks. If there was a fire next to that, we could isolate that remotely now. We can do things that we could not do several years ago. So I think as an individual or as a citizen, there's not money that you need to invest today. I think you already do that. I think what you need to do is encourage the town to continue to foster the relationship between the company and the first responders so that we can continue to prepare and ensure that we're both on the same page and knowledgeable of what's taking place and what we can do to help each other if there was ever some form of an incident. And then the company will continue to invest in the facility. And we, there was a question about the control room, and we are going to invest probably about $10 million to build a new control room and move our people to a more isolated location on the site. And there's other things that we're going to continue to do, even out and around the tanks, to continue to improve the condition and the types of responses that we have to any type of incident on site. So don't spend any money. I don't believe that you should be spending more money in that.
The concern is we're already, spending as part of the LOA for the maintenance of those lamps, and if they're really not going to serve the purpose at any level of security hazard, then I think we have to relook at the whole mitigation system itself. I mean, it's not something for you to decide, but it's something for all of us from the town to decide what would be the best, investment in there.
One of your best resources would probably, to assess that perhaps, and I don't want to put them on the spot, but, to have a conversation with the fire department and, is that a practical tool in addressing, perhaps whether they're perceived or not, but concerns related to the facility. Is that an appropriate tool? And I think that you do have folks with the necessary resources and knowledge base within the community to help you kind of make a maybe more informed decision on that.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Just one quick question. This may actually not be for you, but thank you for coming in. One of the themes that's coming out is around transparency and communication. If not for Peter's report, we wouldn't be sitting here. And my question really is, when you do these independent studies, there's assessments, there's recommendations. With businesses, generally, when there's recommendations, there's also ROI. It's recommended, it's not required by these agencies. And so you delay those, and those recommendations become requirements at some point. So really, if there are folks from the state, from the town officials, I don't know if they're still in the room, is really, what can the town also do to help us to be communicating with the residents? We hear about police log every week from the newspapers, but we don't get reports every 6 months, every year on all of these studies that were done, what was recommended, what's going on. So if we can do something around that, where we are more informed about some of these things, some measures you've already been taken, this is the first time we are hearing. How can we work together and keep the community educated, communicated, and be transparent on what's happening? Again, not to freak people out, but these are things that the community should be aware of. And I'm really, this is recorded, questioning the town officials. This is something that the town officials should be doing regularly so that we don't have to have these kind of forums again and again.
You get a similar report for water we drink every 6 months or every year, right? Even last week, we got a report from our town saying your water is safe, we're doing this, right? Can a Eversource or a town, from a CRS perspective, can they do it? Send us a yearly or every 6 months. Hey, here are the things we're doing.
Exactly, yeah.
Just to feel assured we're taking care.
So that wasn't necessarily directed at me, right?
Yes,
but let me just respond. Let me take the liberty and respond for the town. Perhaps, I think you have multiple folks. I know you have several folks from the select board, and I know you have your first responders here. I don't want to speak for you, but I believe that that's probably heard by them, and I think you ought to give them an opportunity to kind of, think through that a little bit, and maybe there's an opportunity here that our group can work with them, and there may be some availability in the future to provide some type of, more information, over some frequency in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, it was meant to be for the town, but yeah.
My question goes, I know it's almost time, but I just want to go back to the safety exercises that were done, right? As far as I understand, during May it was done, the first week of May, fire drill with the fire department and everybody here. So question is, when was the last one done? And when I heard the responses on that, what I understood is that the next one will be done within a year, but it will not be as intensive as it was this year, and how frequently it's going to happen, and will it be at the same intensity what you did this year?
Yeah, so exercises go into different levels, from a tabletop exercise where we come together, review plans, and as a group go through a scenario where we discuss objectives and ensure the validity of our plan. All the way up to a full scale is what you saw a couple of weeks ago. So to answer your question, when was the last time we did an exercise? Before that was January. Before that was last year. We do it every year. It's
but not
just
at the same
scale.
level.
Correct.
Okay.
The planning for that took over 12 months. So the amount of resources, the time, to do that every year is beyond the ability for us. I also have 9 other facilities that we look at. So, you still get all the benefits of having an exercise at a tabletop level or a functional level where you provide a scenario and you go through that process. And again, plant walkthroughs are part of everything we do every year. So, I caution and say, just because you saw this large fun exercise, and they are fun, let's be honest, we enjoy getting out there and doing that, but there's a full spectrum, and we utilize all of them, from tabletop, functional, full scale, every year.
Okay, so the reason why I asked that.
I just want to follow up with an exercise of this scale. And my understanding has never been performed in the facility until May 4th.
To that scale,
In other words, when was the last time Hopkinton Fire set foot on the Eversource facility for a drill?
for a drill
Correct.
was last year.
So, like, with
Near the tanks.
deployed the.
Just if you go to the mic though.
Yep. So the question was, when was the last time Hopkinton Fire Police came onto the site to do an exercise? We do those every year. The scale of that exercise between tabletop, functional, or full scale varies.
So, couple of follow-ups on that.
Yes, sir.
How frequently do you perform the full-scale drills? That's one. And second, given the size of the facility here, as residents, we are living around it. Shouldn't it be done, the full scale, shouldn't it be done every year, more frequently? That would help you assess how do you plan. The reason being, things are changing. Technology changes. You are replacing a lot of equipment within your facility, right? All those things would warrant changing of these safety measures as well, or the drills, right? You yourself mentioned, I don't know if it was you or somebody else, the drills that were done previously have modified. We have to continuously need to be fluid to make sure we change and adapt to the conditions, right? So that would warrant us to do it more frequently than doing only, detailed and then not detailed, tabletop and all. Like, it's kind of difficult to understand that.
So when you look at the whole spectrum, and we follow what's called the Homeland Security Exercise Evaluation Program, and that's the national standard that you see from every public safety, federal government, state government. That's what we follow. So when we work with MEMA, Massachusetts Emergency Management, they follow HSEEP. And HSEEP is a spectrum of what we said was, the tabletop, the functional, the full scale. And there are certain things that each of those do address. So I don't want anyone to think that, when we do a tabletop or we do a functional exercise, that we don't get the same level of benefit out of that type of exercise. We do. We get a lot of opportunity to go through our plans, to discuss different scenarios, to walk the site, to physically go through any of the material changes on site and condition changes, anything like that. So is this our first time we've done a full-scale exercise? Yes. Do I hope to do that again in the future? Absolutely. It won't be every year, right? Every year we will exercise. Be very clear. Within that national standard spectrum, we will do that. It just won't be a full scale.
Including the tanks, right?
I'm sorry?
Including the storage tank area, not just the liquefaction factory.
So our plans are plant-wide, right? It's not to a specific area. Our emergency response plan, which is specific to this site, is a total comprehensive plan on how we would respond.
But the one which happened on May 4th did not include any inspection of the tanks. That's what the fire chief mentioned.
Correct, because that was not the objective of that specific exercise. So when you design an exercise, you set your training objectives for what you want to test and validate. And in this specific case, we were looking at some very specific objectives. It wasn't on the tanks themselves. It was within the new processing area, because from my perspective, as we're getting ready to commission that piece of equipment, into active service, I wanted the fire department to have the opportunity to see the safety equipment there, to, actually have our exercise to that specific area within the plant. It's not to say we couldn't have picked a different objective, but for that exercise, that's what we had chosen. And that was, go ahead.
What we read, the emails and all, it looked like it took the fire department 8 years to get the approval from the time they asked, it took them 8 years for Eversource to actually get the approval for the drip.
So again, we exercise every year, right? Doing a full-scale exercise like this is a very significant undertaking for both us and the town, right? So when we go through these, we want to make sure that they are absolutely worth everybody's time. And when I say everybody, it's not just the fire police for Hopkinton. It was all of the mutual aid companies that we brought in. So we had all these community partners, that you probably saw their fire trucks out there participating in this.
I'll close my comments just by one request to the town officials is that when this safety protocol plan, whatever evacuation or the safety plan, can that be made public, at least the high-level outline of it, so we as residents can look at it and feel that something is there that we know we can adhere to, right? That goes for the town officials as a request as a resident from the town.
And we've been working with the town to provide a copy of the emergency plan that doesn't cover any of the sensitive, information for the plant, right? We don't want things going out into public information through Freedom of Information Act or other things that would put the plant at risk to some type of, attack. And those are one of the things that we prepare for today that we have to worry about in our world, unfortunately. So, we do have some things in place now where they've got emergency response plans, they've got redacted different plans, to be able to improve our coordination with the FD, to have that they can have copies of the plan in their trucks as they are responding to the situation so that that first responding officer can flip through it, refresh himself from the training he got previously, things like that. So I'm more than happy to work with the town. I think they've got some of the materials at this point that you're looking for. At that higher level, not going to tell you how to shut the plant down, unfortunately. That's got a big black box around it. Yes, sir.
One thing, too, to just keep in mind, while, yes, the scenario we did this year was related, up in the kind of new equipment area, probably 90% of what we learned, and correct me if I'm, overstating that, is about things as simple as communication, access to the facility. We have, while there's many of the folks from the fire department in Hopkinton that come to our site on a regular basis, when the town of Ashland or Southborough responds, what gate do they go to? If you walk past the facility, there's probably, we've got dozens of gates. We've got multiple just off the road. Where do they respond to? So a lot of what they're learning through this is communication, how to access the facility, how to navigate around the facility, what the roadways are. We have several dirt roadways. We have several paved roadways. What type of fire equipment is on site, and that's pretty consistent throughout the facility. So a lot of what we're doing is related around communication. Who is Josh coordinating with the day of? Or if it's not Josh, who in his group would they be coordinating with, or who at Eversource would they be communicating with? Where would the first responders set up kind of a command post? That's the type of things that these drills really help to kind of ferret out for us, is where is some of the most basic things are where we get caught up with. And that's the type of thing that these scenarios, regardless of where the actual event took place on site, that we really iron out through a lot of these drills.
And the outcome of that, what we call an after-action report, signed jointly by Eversource, Chief Miller, Chief Bennett. We should be finishing, and I've got half my signatures now. I need 2 more signatures, and our plan is to share that with the board. And it goes through some of those things that Jim was just identifying, with simple things like putting street names on the roads inside the plant. Makes it just easier to communicate, point directions, things like that.
Just a suggestion. I did some work years ago with facilities that had high hazardous materials included. LNG was on my radar at the time, but not this particular facility, but mostly chemical plants. And they were trying to comply with something called the Risk Management Planning Rule, which is the Clean Air Act provision, but it requires the plants to go through a similar, it sounds like a similar process that you go through in safety check and so forth. But they also require a risk communication plan that goes with all of that, and which is what I'm suggesting, that maybe that's something the community could use. Typically, it would involve a repository at the local library and or the local health or environmental department, where the documents for each of these agencies that are consumable by the public are co-located, so that somebody doesn't have to go to 6 different agencies to try to collect that walkthrough report that was done here, et cetera. But they call community repositories, and they can include fact sheets on specific issues. For example, your current plans for equipment upgrades and or safety improvements and so forth. So that's just a suggestion. I don't know whether the town would be open to that.
And I think, communication's always one of the hardest things to do during an emergency response. You can never get information out fast enough, and sometimes, you want to get, and I need just a little bit more details, and it's always a struggle to say, let me get some information out. I may not be 100% correct, or I may not have all the information yet, but provide you what I can. Within our overall emergency response plan, so I mentioned a moment ago that the plant has a plant-specific emergency plan that we developed with FD. They were co-writers with us. We have an emergency response plan for the gas business unit, and we have an all hazards plan for Eversource. And they work conjunction. So that's, it's their building blocks, right? This is my overall response. Now I get a little more specific. In our emergency response plan, we have that communications where we go through a lot of different paths, whether that be through our liaison program, who's embedded at the Emergency Operations Center within the city, to our communications officers that are issuing press releases, whether that be through social, traditional media, things like that, to having an embedded individual from fire and police with us in our command center to improve that communication flow from us at a leadership level back to town manager and things like that that can provide citizens some more of that messaging. So all that's available today. It's public record. We file it every year, and we provide the community a copy of that. So, again, going back to a database, I would refer that to the town, but they have a lot of that information. Same thing that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But to kind of what was discussed earlier, that's probably a great way to kind of compile all the information that's already publicly available, but make it more accessible than each of us trying to search through databases that are online and, quite honestly, very difficult to navigate. So that's a good suggestion.
Hi. Can you comment a little bit on the dikes that surround the tank facility? Because I read all kinds of information out there. Apparently, the dike height is only 10 feet, and it's one of the lowest of LNG facilities out there. Are those dikes up to current compliance, up to current federal standards in compliance, or were they just grandfathered in and things like that? Can you talk about that?
Do you want to talk to that, either of you? Anyone but me?
Yeah, so the facility spill containment system, so there's federal code requirements defining, based on the tank size and the configuration, what that volumetric capacity needs to be. So there's 3 different types of tank types, and those tank types will dictate what the dikes are. These are single containment tanks, which are the most common, tanks in the U.S. Sometime in the 2000s, we saw 1 or 2 facilities do a double, and then we started to see some facilities do a full containment tank. So this system is a traditional one that's still used with some facilities today, where you have a sloping and grading to a remote area. So if you do have a spill, the spill would be taken away. So that way, if you have a failure of one tank, it's not going to take down tank 2 or 3. It's going to be conveyed to kind of a remote area. What you wouldn't do is kind of bathtub the tanks, where if you have a failure of tank 1, that cryogenic load is going to flow under the 2. If you did that, you would have to increase the size of the dikes. So there's a 193 is your main code, and that references NFPA 59A. For dikes, you are allowed to use a lot of different materials. So you can use rock, you can use gravel, you can use dirt, you can use crushed stone, you can use concrete. You can pretty much use any material that's able to contain LNG. Regarding the height, I wouldn't say these are the smallest ones. This is probably average size. The height of the dike wall really depends on, it's a function of volume. So the closer you are to the tank, the higher the walls need to be. The further away you are from the tank, the lower the walls need to be. So code requires that you capture a volume, and it's up to you and also the site topography and the size of the site to determine what those length, width, and height ratios need to be to make sure you comply with those code requirements.
All right, thank you.
I think, Jim, I know you, so you're an honest guy, and there's a lot of, we want to be a good neighbor here, and I think this forum is a show of good faith. I think that's great, so thank you, and I applaud you for that. This is a question probably not for you guys, but anybody from Eversource in the room that wants to address the issue of why Eversource continues to sue the town of Hopkinton to avoid paying their fair share or the assessed value of the property at the Hopkinton LNG facility. Is there anybody that can address that?
I don't think I know the specifics of that. I mean, it's my understanding that we've, pursued abatements on our property. I can't give you the specifics, but I mean, we can clearly get back to you, but the way we operate as a business, we would be operating within the parameters to, question taxes or anything of that nature and try to be a good corporate citizen, but on the other hand, making sure that we maintain our rights to, pursue things that we think are fair treatment for us.
Right, so I mean, as you research this, you sued and lost for a period of years. You've now sued again for a subsequent period of years. And in that process, you essentially are saying, your justification essentially is that the facility really isn't worth very much. And so the assessed value should be lower. And the facility isn't worth much because the equipment is very old. In fact, it's beyond its useful life, 40 years. According to your experts and your own energy department, it's beyond its useful life. But here, Jim stands up and says, well, it doesn't really apply to a tank because useful life isn't really relevant. So you understand my confusion as a resident that your expert here says that it doesn't really apply, but then your experts over here say that it's really quite old. And just why I care about this is because it affects my tax rate and everybody in this room too. If you don't pay as much as you should, we have to pay more.
So Peter, I'll simplify it because you're confused about it, but no different than when you purchase a vehicle and you drive it off the lot and the value of that vehicle decreases immediately. That doesn't make the vehicle in any less condition than it did 30 seconds before it drove off the lot. Regarding the taxes, I don't think it's a fair statement to say that we're not paying our fair share. I cannot speak to how the taxes and what the strategy is by the tax department. I think Eversource wants to ensure that we are paying our fair share, because keep in mind, the taxes that we're paying are being paid for by the ratepayers. So all of you who are gas customers ultimately bear that burden, not just in Hopkinton, but across the Commonwealth where we have all of our customers. So we do want to ensure that the taxes that we're paying in all the communities that we have infrastructure is fair. I don't know where we stand currently, but I do know for many years we were the number 2 or 3 highest paying tax customer in the town. I know Dell came in, I think maybe changed that a little bit. I don't know where they stand today. I think we may be back up into the top or pretty close. So now Legacy is now the new largest tax base. But, I don't know where we are at this point with our tax department, but certainly, I don't think that they're necessarily trying to skirt some process. I know, certainly it probably exerts some amount of pain on the attorneys and the folks in town that have to deal with that. But, the company's strategy is not to not pay our fair share. It's to ensure that the ratepayers or the gas customers are paying a fair share. I think that's important.
Hey, my question is around the safety. So as we all know, every year Boston Marathon starts here in Hopkinton, and we know what happened a few years back in the marathon. So is Eversource or the town, I don't know whose responsibility it is, are you going to take any, or are you taking any extra care or extra security on those days? Because, you know, there are people coming from all parts of the world to participate.
Great question. It's a little separate than the LNG, but absolutely we do. So leading up to the race, we do additional surveys of all of our pipeline going down any of the marathon route. Part of that, if we discover any type of hazardous leak on our distribution system or anything like that, that's repaired before race day. When it comes to the race day itself, we have crews strategically positioned along the entire route, both sides, so that we can, you know, we're not fighting to try and get from one side to the other. And we staff up additional personnel to do that. So, you know, we take marathon day just as serious as anyone else. So, you know, we want to make sure we're prepared and everyone has a safe opportunity to enjoy that day. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and we, as a facility, change our operations specific to that. I mean, that's a very, you know, even for my family personally, that day changed 10 years ago, many things for our family. We as a company put a lot of effort into ensuring the activities that are taking place on site that day are limited. We don't, you know, we basically cancel all construction. We typically shut down the plant. We plan ahead of time so that that facility is not operating in any mode that's, you know, unnecessary at the time. So, you know, there's probably much more that is done at the public safety level beyond just what we do as a company, but we definitely certainly take that very important step to ensure we're doing as little as possible as we can at the facility.
Good evening, and thank you for patiently answering all the questions. I know we are beyond time. Can I still ask a few questions?
Yes, we have a hard stop at midnight. I have some. Keep going.
Oh, then I have a very short window.
We pay Phil by the hour also, so please.
Okay, I have a very short window, I guess, then. All right. We know that the mitigation system that was transferred is not up to the mark, as you said, and might not be the appropriate thing. But from Eversource perspective, do you have any vapor mitigation system? This is not just for legacy farms, because if ever there is a leakage of a high magnitude, you know, we have seen the flows and the report, how far and wide it can go. We have seen those images. So do you have any mitigation system, not really limited to legacy farms, but for everybody here?
Yeah. So as part of the plant design, because we have gas detection, low temperature detection, we have a lot of sensory devices that perhaps the plant probably didn't have when it was first constructed. We're able to interlock those with other process devices such as valves and shutoffs and electrical shutoffs and that type of thing to really help respond within seconds of an incident. You know, if there was some event, some abnormal operating condition or process condition, we're able to respond to that, you know, very quickly and make the get the process to a safe state. So, you know, we do have other designs or items that are in place based on designs that we've used, you know, both in industry and at our other facilities.
Right. So I do understand a bit of the automation control systems and the responses that you're talking about. So I think what it really is that you are saying from an operational perspective, from the operations of the plants and the automation control systems, you have a very fast reaction time in being able to control any further escalation of the vapors that have escaped. But if there are vapors that have escaped from an end user perspective, if you're really talking not from a plant operations perspective, something that has already gone into the air, do you have any defense mechanism on the perimeters of the plant, you know, not really inside the plant?
So we do, you know, we do use fire. You know, you don't think of it this way, and typically we would say you shouldn't be putting water on LNG. However, we do use water spray to kind of control LNG or natural gas vapor, so we can kind of control the spread of it in the case of an emergency. But one thing that we have conscientiously made as a decision as a company is, as you're probably aware, we have purchased, essentially as much property around us has been made available, including within your property, the buffer that was purchased by the company. And that was done very much deliberately to ensure that we had as much buffer as possible, to ensure that we controlled to the extent possible any clearing of trees. So obviously there's a certain amount of trees that need to be cleared to make, way for some construction activities and other things. But, I think there was a solar panel or solar farm proposed on our property across Legacy Farms North between us and Kruger Lane. As a business unit, and we're not the final decision makers, but as a business unit, we were able to exert enough pressure to kind of make that go away, because we felt, for us, maintaining that tree, that set of tree line, those trees and that tree line was important to ensure that, one, we don't have, kind of unmitigated, because trees help to break up, any type of vapor. We wanted to maintain that, and so that's providing buffer, maintaining trees as much as possible. Those are kind of strategies that we have in place at all of our facilities, quite honestly. Whenever we have the opportunity, we take advantage of.
Okay, so a correlated question. Do you still think that for legacy farms we need a mitigation system? Because the 14 lamps that we know, that the LOA and HOA and all others, I don't know who really owns it, who maintains it, we don't know. But do you still think, based on the mitigation systems that you have, we still need one, or we do not need one? What would be your recommendation?
I don't want to give you a recommendation per se, but, I think we've said it, and, as a company, we've said this publicly. What you have today doesn't make a lot of sense to us, and we don't think that it's an appropriate use or appropriate measure.
All right, I see you're giving a politically correct sentence, which is fine. That's fine.
Do you need a different method of mitigation, I think is what your question is, and I think as I said earlier.
That's not a question. That's not the question, but you have answered it in a politically correct way, which is fine. I'll leave it at that, because I think we need to explore from our perspective. We need to find out what is an appropriate system and then potentially get it, because that's for our safety. I think at this point of time, we don't have an owner for that. We will have to figure that out, but we'll take that as a takeaway. We'll keep it as a takeaway for now, so that I can go to other questions.
Would you like to hear
Yeah,
from Phil?
Of course. I'm not an Eversource employee, so I'll give you my honest opinion. I'm on one of the NFPA 59A code committees.
Okay.
And if they thought that was a good system, we would put it in code. Code tells you to minimize ignition sources. We follow that code. You do not want to ignite something. So code also has multiple layers of protection. I know you get, just for everybody, we have basic process control systems. We have SIS systems. All of those monitor all of the different sensors which can automatically shut down. We have ESD systems. We have fire gas detection. And to your point, just in case any of those 9 layers of protection fail, we have the ability with fire water monitors to knock stuff down. That's adding heat, which allows it to warm up, which gets it to rise. Code, we have an entire section on electrical area classification. We design things to be electrically classified, because in the event that you do have a potential failure of those 9 layers of protection, you don't want to ignite it. You want to isolate it, stop the flow, let it disperse. That's the safest thing to do. You don't want to ignite it and burn it back to the source, which can just cascade and make things worse. So I'm not speaking from an Eversource perspective. From a code committee standpoint, that's what we do for code. Code has had major rewrites in the last 10 years. We're always incorporating newer technology. If there are safer systems, different technologies, we're putting that in code. You have some of the most world-renowned experts on that committee. If they thought what you're doing was a good idea, it would have been in code within the last 3 revisions.
Okay, so that's very good to know this. Thank you for that. So, no. But let me ask you another question based on what you just said. if this is the case, then why was it done in 2014 before the promoter got the permission to build, the legacy farms and go ahead with it? He was asked, I don't know by which agency, that you need to have a mitigation system in place, and that's the reason that vapor mitigation system was put in place. If it is so secure, the 9 layers of security and everything else, why is it that the promoter had to take an additional permission and he had to appoint an, he did.
He employed his own company.
Correct. I was going there. So he employed another risk mitigation company to, get an approval and then go ahead with it, because a permission was required and a mitigation system had to be put in place. But I think this will detract the whole discussion. I can park it.
I'll just ask one question. This is not about the mitigation system. So if there is excess LNG in the tank, is it actually burnt off or not? Like to maintain pressure or anything? Do you I know
The excess LNG we draw off with the compressors and put back in the system.
And at some point is the LNG actually so when the vapors actually come out, if there is too much, is it burnt off so that the cloud doesn't escape? Or it's never done?
No.
At all?
No.
Because based on some of the pictures of different LNG facilities, I have seen pictures of like huge
vapor clouds,
fire coming out of all these facilities, liquefaction factories.
I think you're probably talking about either ground flares maybe, or, but I think, I don't want to just, I think, to answer your question, I think the organization or body, I think was probably that dictated that, was the developer and I think the planning board, and I believe, it's been a long time, but I believe you have one of those individuals behind you.
So I'll give him
Can we just, I just want to answer one question before we get to the next so it doesn't get too confusing in fairness. I think you want to probably address this question.
Yes. My name's Ken Weissmantle. I was chair of the planning board when we approved Legacy North. I'm going to disagree a little bit with Jim, and I've toured the plant with him many, many years ago. I've also spent 17 years of my career in LNG, and other than in cryogenics, I've actually built an LNG small-scale facility. I've built a liquid hydrogen facility. I've built several hundred liquid helium and liquid oxygen, liquid nitrogen facilities. So and probably the company I used to work for might have done the heat exchangers for your current upgrade. So I know a little bit about what you're talking about. I'm going to disagree with Jim on a couple things on the vapor portion. First of all, Eversource, and I've lived in town since 1981. Eversource has done a poor job over the since the 70s of buying any of the land around them. All of Wilson Street been developed, I'll say, in the late 80s. You had an opportunity to buy all of Legacy Farms, quite frankly. There's a lot of different pieces of land, and quite frankly, we were talking about the code. The code also says that in the vapor exclusion zone, you don't build anything, and nobody lives in the vapor exclusion zone. And the code also says you don't put a road right through the middle of the vapor exclusion zone. Now, to the gas lights. Gas lights are commonly used in crew quarters on a drilling platform because they don't want the fire to get into the crew quarters. And quite frankly, if you could contain it on your property, that's fine. And that's why the code says you don't build anything in the vapor exclusion zone. So after it gets off the property, it's our concern as residents in town. And at that point, yes, the consultants say it would stop it from burning houses and people. All the people in Legacy Farms are outside the thermal exclusion zone. That's the other part of that you would worry about. So you're safe from the thermal exclusion zone is basically, the fire is so hot that basically trees and paper and people and, houses just catch on fire. So you're outside that zone. But the vapor, if it keeps going, I've spilled liquid nitrogen, just a couple hundred gallons. And you see it flowing down the parking lot. I mean, you see the cloud because it's actually the water vapor that's getting cold. You don't see liquid nitrogen, you don't see LNG because it's clear and colorless, etc. But you will see a cloud, and it hugs the ground. And I guarantee at the edge of the ground, or at the edge of the cloud, there is the mixture that will ignite if there's an ignition source. And you'll have the proper oxygen, methane at that mixture. And as it goes down the cloud, it kind of mixes. And so, yeah, the vapor, is a concern. Do I feel really good hearing all the improvements to the plant and everything that, the new liquefier? That's absolutely perfect. Back to Peter's comment earlier where he's asking the questions on the seismic. The company I work for also had a nuclear division. We made all sorts of nuclear equipment, and we made stuff for Seabrook. Well, some of our equipment was in the way base of the reactor, so it was built first. And then came along computerized stress codes. And they also decided in the early part that, my goodness, Cape Ann, in I think it was 1755, had a magnitude 6 earthquake. Now, it hasn't happened since 1755, but every chimney to Connecticut from Cape Ann is near Gloucester, for those people that really don't know Massachusetts. So yeah, it might be a good idea to rerun the seismic code on this plant, just to make sure that, somebody didn't design it with a seismic code of 2 or 3, as opposed to, looking at what actually happened a bunch of years ago. But our company, we got paid millions of dollars to redo all the equipment that was buried in the basement of Seabrook after the codes came around and they upped the seismic requirement on that critical facility. So I guess, the safety lanterns are a last line of defense for the people out and around it. And until something else comes better, that's the best that the town's consultants at the time could come up with to protect the portions. And the zoning requirement had a clause that said that whatever we approved had to be safe. At the other hand, the town probably didn't want to get sued if we suddenly would have told that developer that, his big project that he invested millions and millions of dollars on the roadways and et cetera, else like that, would not be able to allow it to be done. But that all gets back to the fact that Eversource, while they control the 55-acre north open space parcel, they could have bought the whole thing for $20-something million. Anyway, that's it.
So one quick question. So thank you so much for bringing this. I had a few slides talking about the thermal exclusion zone and also about Legacy Farms community, how that came into being. Of course, I wasn't allowed to present. But the thing is, for us as citizens who are living at that place, whether it's the mitigation system at the LNG facility or outside the LNG facility, we are the people who are living close to that facility. And sometimes we wonder, why did the town even approve this construction altogether? The thing is, yeah, all it needed was 5 votes to approve construction and put all of us at risk. And then we are talking about, Jim, you mentioned that this tank, as per its functional state, only 30% of its capacity has been used. It has like really long life. We can never say how long it lasts. All that is wonderful and great. So I think there should be some form. The town has to pressurize Eversource maybe, or someone else, or maybe Roy McDowell, for God's sake. We sent him an email asking him to attend today, but obviously we didn't present anything related to that. The thing is, someone has to take responsibility. If there's money on the line, people will do the job. If there is an incident, all of us should get paid. No one should be at risk. No one should lose their life. No one should die of asthma or pneumonia. We understand this is all nice and beautiful, but it's bullshit according to me.
actually speak. Go ahead. I'll continue after.
Yeah. I mean, I thank Eversource for coming here and then presenting your point of view. I mean, as a resident, my question is more to the town because, we have a lot of questions for Eversource, but, as we all know, these tanks were there from 50 years, but the town gave permission to build this community, knowing, yes, we have 3 tanks. So what I am really concerned is, yes, we all came here, we were excited to join the community, and then once, all that excitement settles down, now we look at, okay, we are in this community, it's a very close community, and if you look at the exits, particularly, I live in phase 3, so we have 2 streets, Aspen Way and Popular Way, and there are 250 homes within that, and there is only one exit towards the LFN North Road. If there is any emergency, irrespective of whether it is anything related to the gas or any natural disaster or whatever, right? So all the 250 homes, they need to come, and then they need to exit. So fire chief is here, so I'm wondering, so what is the evacuation plan? So how do we plan, irrespective of what we are talking about today? There could be a fire or any other. So how do you see, I want to hear from fire chief, how you foresee that, there are 250 homes coming in one direction, and then the exit is only 100 feet apart, but 250 homes, they need to come from, like far away. So how do we foresee, we need to understand, if there is an emergency, how do we get out? How do we get out of our community? Because, this is not like, okay, Hopkinton is big, and this community is very heavy concentrated. We have several concerns regarding how, the ROI got permission to build in a way, such a way that, we see the roads, they are narrow. It's not easy to drive and get out. So I want to hear from town, and maybe anyone from the fire chief. So what is the mitigation? If there is an emergency, how we would be able to get out? We need to understand that, such that, we can plan for any disaster that, it may happen. Not necessarily for Eversource, but, it's general,
Thank you. Good question. As I stated earlier, for me to stand here and tell you that this is exactly how we're going to evacuate, I can't do that. Every emergency that we go to is different in its own dynamic way, and we will adjust. We have an ICS system that we follow, incident command, our hazard mitigation. We'll be looking at that from fire, police, all the emergency aspect sides, and we'll make those decisions as we're responding and as we're going. I cannot stand here and tell you that on Tuesday of next week, if there's an emergency at the LNG plant, that we're all gonna go out Legacy Farms North. I can't. And no fire chief is gonna stand here and be able to tell you that. Again, you have to look at the situation in front of you. We've worked with Eversource. As Josh was up here talking, we're planning, we're working on that, and that's how we're going to mitigate it. It's going to be dynamic.
Yeah, that, unfortunately, that doesn't give a lot of confidence to us.
So I understand that, but it could be any neighborhood in Hopkinton. It could be a house fire that spreads one to another. We have multiple streets with cul-de-sacs that only one way in, one way out. These are all things, as we're going, as we're responding, that's what we look at, and that's how we operate.
Yeah, I understand that, but is there any cul-de-sac anywhere with 250 homes coming through one exit?
And 300 billion cubic feet of LNG sitting in tanks.
And next week, right? So it's a different situation. I understand that, as the citizens who pay taxes, we are really concerned. We bought the homes, we pay high price, and then we pay high taxes. We want to see town addressing these issues that we continuously we are here for 3-4 years. Now we try to understand, what it is to live here. So we want town to proactively, give us some assurance that, yes, there are ways, to mitigate it. Because when I look at it, how can 250 homes are there? It's more like a cul-de-sac. and then there are more homes on the other side. They all need to go in one direction. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, we are here, but we want to have some kind of action plan or some kind of an exercise, which could give us some confidence, We always need to plan for a worst case scenario. I work in a pharmaceutical industry. We do processes before we put into a plan. We always plan for the worst case scenario. Yes, we know it's a best case scenario, but we always want to plan for the worst case scenario, whether it's a chance like it happen in once in a million times or whatever. But you need to have something in place. So we want to understand, so how do we do this evacuation from this community where we have 500 or 600 or even 1,000 homes now, we are building more homes, how they are going to be evacuated,
Again, I cannot stand here in a good conscience and tell you this is exactly how it's going to happen. Let me ask a question in return to you. We have a microburst or a tornado that comes through town and we have to do an evacuation. It would fall under the same premise. It's a disaster, whether it's man-made or natural, and we will react to it as that happens and as we're responding. That's how we operate in the fire service.
Yes, it's a natural disaster is different, but an industrial disaster is not at the same level as a natural disaster, right? So even the insurance, right? Yeah, there is no coverage for a natural disaster.
And tornadoes are something which occur on a regular basis. There are agencies like FEMA and 100 other agencies which have action plans in place, what needs to be done, step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on. They may not, we are not looking for a response right now to tell you, we are not expecting you to tell us which road to get out and expecting you to have a plan right now. If you don't, would the fire department work on an action plan or an emergency response plan? I had an ERG question as well.
So we do operate from an ERG, whether it be our ERG that we have specifically for multiple hazardous situations, the ERG plan that we've worked with Eversource on building for specifically for their plant. And that does tell us evacuation routes, evacuation zones. It doesn't give a specific route. And I can't, I think you're asking me on, again, next Tuesday at noontime, if something happens, how are we going to leave? I can't give you that answer. We have to look at the situation at hand. We all know what is the main road. It's Legacy Farms North. It's either you're going to go out on the east side or you're going to go out on the west side. Seriously. So that's how we would look at it and say, what is the less? Life safety is number one for us no matter what incident we go to.
Was the fire department considered, did the planning board reach out to fire department for guidance and suggestions before they approved this facility?
I cannot answer that. I was not fire chief at that time, so I cannot give you an answer for that.
Because when I spoke to one of the members of the planning board, I was told that we just depend on what the DPU says, what Eversource says, in terms of, just depending on different agencies, but not actually doing the detailed investigation themselves. Back then there weren't so many people. Now there are more than 2,000 people living there.
Chief, to an extent, I think you're selling your plan a little bit short, and I don't know that you need to talk too much to it, but having been in the room when we talk about, some of the potential responses, you've dictated to us that between reverse 911 and going door to door to notify residents, I think one thing to recognize is that, I'm not really sure where phase 3 is, quite honestly, but there's been a lot of numbers in that original report that was done that were very much flawed. There's been some numbers, I think Peter and I had talked about, there was some numbers and some calculation that was in the newspaper that was off by a very large magnitude. There's I think a lot of things out there that's a little bit misinformation. So how much of an extent that would actually truly need to be evacuated, I think that's where it may be somewhat exaggerated what people think in their mind versus what the reality is. But that could be fluid. So what I would say, though, is I think you've clearly conveyed to us some of the steps that you would take in order to ensure that there was kind of an orderly evacuation. And a lot of that has been in coordination with the police department and the police chief, and ensuring that you'd utilize resources to ensure traffic flow in a certain direction so that you don't have people trying to come back to their house and people trying to leave in kind of chaos. So, don't sell yourself short. I think you have talked through this certainly with us, and I don't know what your plans are, and I don't think you can talk today to, I'm going to evacuate this radius, but you have I've heard you talk about plans on how you would evacuate. So, I mean, we've discussed that with Josh previously.
You are correct, Jim. But again, it's dynamic on the situation that's in front of us. How far out does it go? Is it in the immediate hot zone, warm zone, cold zones? People in the cold zones, we're not going to get evacuated. Again, we have reverse 911. We do have, we could go out and do door knockers where we physically knock on people's doors. Those are last-ditch efforts. We're going to be looking at directly what's in front of us and say who needs to be evacuated, and then look at that route and go from there. Good.
Okay. All right, if you're still up for question. This is on air quality. So I think we touched upon it in few of the previous questions, so I was holding on to that. But those were again focused for the air quality within the plant. It is not really focused on the air quality that is for the residents in and around the plant. So I see that as a differentiation between the air quality that we are speaking, and I want to call it out before I ask the question. I think, do you have any air quality monitoring stations which are around the plant, not within the plant, so that the residents or, in the areas that you have bought or whichever way. So do you have something around the plants to monitor the air quality? That's the first question I have, and I have a few for the air quality.
So no, the company does not, because certainly those would be looking at not only emissions from the plant, but it could look at air quality from any ambient source, right? Yep. Whether that's the forest fires right now that are kind of plaguing the north portion of the country, to automotive emissions and that type of thing. Now, I do know, I think it was MIT or something had done some surveys of the area, and I don't know that we ever received any feedback or summary of what that was. So, but as you're talking about outside of the plant, no, we don't monitor the air quality out there. We do monitor our contribution to that. Okay.
Basically, what you're implying is you are computing your contribution to the ambient air quality. And do you comply with the CFR Part 50, I believe, or the US EPA standards? But I think if you're not even monitoring outside the plant, there is, I don't know how you would comply to it or how it is enforced, because it's all internal to the plant. I'm not, as you said, there is nothing outside the plant that you measure.
So I don't, I'm not intimately familiar with, the EPA's regulation specific to that.
I have it. I can share it. I mean, if you want. Well, I have the national standard, and you can search it up. Yeah.
But it's probably not going to help, right? Because I won't be able to speak to it. But what I will say is Mass DEP's regulations have to be as strict, or in many cases are stricter than EPA's, or the federal regulatory, the federal agencies' requirements. We do meet all of those. Now, they may have kind of ambient air quality limits and such, and I don't know what their monitoring program is for that, but what they do is they take emission sources, for whether those are emission sources from, I don't know what the town has in commercial buildings, but they may have boilers, and those may have air permits associated with them. There may be other air permits throughout the town associated with, some filling stations and stuff. They review our air permit or the plan that we submitted, and I have to, I don't want to say assume, but they take that into consideration when they review kind of the overall, I guess, air permits for a region. But from our perspective, we certainly are meeting, we've provided all the emissions that we produce, the potential to produce, and we live within those permit conditions.
Okay, yeah, because what I understand is that how many times what kind of a gas can be released in a particular year by a LNG plant, that is also fixed by the EPA, but I don't know how it is being measured or if it is being measured, because your air permit itself had been significantly delayed, though you had applied within the 6 months period. So I don't know how it all correlates to, but that is, I don't know how the correlation is. So I don't know if you have anything to share on that.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, even, I'm also not clear on how this is working out, but I know that there is no measurement of the ambient air quality that we are aware of. The nearest, I believe, is Southborough. Yeah, so the nearest that where we are measuring ambient air quality is Southborough, which is significantly far and nowhere close to the LNG plant. Yeah, 7 miles away. Yeah.
So just to add, the plant does comply with PHMSA Section 114, which requires us to have plans in place to mitigate, reduce, or correct fugitive gases. And we have gone through the audits, and we have passed those audits.
Yeah, I'm sure you have, because again, this is within the plant. You know, the difference is what you are saying really applies to the operations of the plant. That is different from the ambient air quality. I don't know who is measuring the ambient air quality, if anybody. Yeah, the nearest being way far away. So that's fine. I think that's about it, because I can't ask subsequent questions until we have a handle on this. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Sorry, I came late and I have a very quick question. I'm not sure if this has been asked before, but just how long do you plan to use the facilities? I mean, when this, because it's already past like 40 years life expectancy, and when it was, I mean, the original plan, like when it reaches like the 40 years. So what was the original plan? Yeah, so like, are you going to like use it forever? Like, I mean, I'm just curious. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, because it's yeah. This
certainly, likely not forever. We were talking the other day about certainly not forever. However, we'll continue to review the tanks and assess their condition to determine if we can continue to extend their life. And that'll be based on, many pieces of criteria and information that we gather related to them. Obviously, the goals of the state related to kind of moving towards other or alternative energy sources, that's a big component of it. LNG, my understanding, and in natural gas, I think in general, but LNG provides, an ability for the state to move in that direction, but still have a reliable source, but without perhaps having to invest in some much larger new infrastructure, primarily probably pipelines, which may still be necessary to an extent, but we kind of, I think, as a state, as an energy policy, need some form of a bridge to get to that future state of energy supply for the Commonwealth. And so right now LNG is a part of that, is one of the tools that's necessary to kind of get there. So will we have any natural gas in 100 years? I guess I can't answer that question, but we will continue to maintain the tanks as long as they continue to exhibit that they're in good condition. So if that's 10 years, 20 years, or 100 years, I think, right now, we'll just continue to maintain them as long as there's a need for that commodity to serve the public.
Okay, so originally, like when it was, I mean, when you had the plan, I mean, so there was like no plan B, like, but the life expectancy was 40 years, right? So at that time, when it was built, so there was like no plan. So when 40 years later, so what?
Yeah, so it's very typical to design. You need to have an input, so into your design conditions, and so you need to specify how many years is that piece of equipment going to be designed for, so that the engineer can engineer the system to hopefully last that long. But there's a lot of things that go into that. So we have to pick a design life. And so, I can't speak for the designers at the time, but they chose 30 to 40 years for the LNG storage tank. And that's pretty typical for any industrial piece of equipment. However, as you approach that, or not even before you approach that, you need to continually assess that equipment to make sure that, the design life is not deteriorating significantly faster than you had anticipated. So, while it had a design life of, we'll just say 30 years, that didn't mean we walked away from the tank and said, we'll come back and look at it in 30 years. We inspect it frequently and regularly up to that point. And if we saw that the condition was degrading, we would adjust for that. We have inspected and performed that data analysis, and it is performing well.
Okay.
And we and our consultants clearly believe that these can be extended for their life, and we're going to continue to assess them, but we'll continue to push the life out as they continue to exhibit good condition.
Okay. Thank you.
Just related to that, as a company, right, so this facility is very important for you to maintain, whatever is needed such that it can be supplied, you can supply the gas. So what if a regulator comes tomorrow and says, oh, you need to shut down? Hopefully they can do it, Eversource is a big company. So what do you do, So when you plan for like 40 years, right, so is there any plan from Eversource rather than investing on this facility to refurbish it and then extend the life? Do you have plans beyond this saying, okay, rather than reinvesting on this, is there something that you could do, like build a different, another facility somewhere in the middle of the woods or somewhere?
Yeah.
Is there any thought process?
Yeah, there is. So, and I can't get too in-depth because this is a completely different department in the company, and it's a much larger strategy. But what I do know is that FERC hosted last fall an energy summit or something along those lines they call it. I don't remember exactly what they called it, but it was really to look at the energy stability for all of New England. And within there's a recognition that the New England states, I think particularly Massachusetts, are looking to move towards cleaner forms of energy. And I think there's a recognition by the federal government and the New England states that you can't just pull that plug. There needs to be, the transition has to happen over a period of time. And if you just look the last 10 years, we've migrated, there used to be multiple coal-fired plants in New England. Well, those mostly, I'm not sure today if any of those exist at this point. So we've begun that migration. However, the next step, we've become so reliant on natural gas electric generation, and the customers, we still continue to get many new customers looking for natural gas because it's a relatively clean alternative and economically priced. And at the end of the day, for many customers, the price of your energy dictates what you are able to do with the rest of your money. So we continue to need to supply customers with an affordable energy source. And from that energy summit was that it's recognized that LNG, at least for now, is, LNG and natural gas is kind of that bridge to the future. And how long that will take, I can't tell you. Could they just pull the plug today? I suspect that's not possible. But that, again, is way above my, understanding. But certainly, the transformation that'll happen over time, that's something that Eversource is committed to. We're very much involved with, geothermal pilot plants and all kind of, hydrogen and other, energy sources and forms. So, it's certainly important to the company, but it's going to take time.
Thank you.
And we're kind of that bridge to get there.
First, I want to thank, the community for coming out tonight and raising all of these, thoughtful questions. I really, for those of you that have really hung here to this late hour, I really thank you. We appreciate the dialogue. We know there'll be ongoing dialogue. I want to thank Jim, Phil, and Kirk for their answers. I hope we demonstrated that we're out here tonight. We're trying to answer questions, put the community more at ease, have an open dialogue, and continue that. I want to thank, like I said, the public officials that came tonight and also have participated working very closely with us. So once again, thank you very much, and we appreciate your time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.